Hello everyone and welcome to my third chapter of Sao-Link's Monster Train Clan Guide. Today we are gonna look at the Umbra and their morsel eating monstrosities and how we can best use their cards, abilities and artifacts, as well as their champion upgrade paths. So let's head over to the logbook so we can have a look at the things we let's start with the champion. So Penumbra starts out at 3 capacity, so he needs a lot of space for himself. But luckily there are a few ways in Umbra to deal with that. So, Penumbra has 3 upgrade paths. There's Architect, which has okay stats. They become quite significant in the later stages of the game. Um, he also gets a summon ability that gives +2, 3 or 4 capacity on the floor you play him on. So that means by the end Penumbra will actually take up negative capacity if you go for the architect path. Um, this champion path of Penumbra is quite useful because he can be a decent backliner and still leave enough room for a frontliner to gorge some morsels. Most frontliners are gonna be 2 capacity, so early on you can play Penumbra, a 2 capacity unit, and still feed 2 morsels to them. If it's a 3 capacity unit, it will be a bit more difficult. You will only have room for 1 morsel. Later on, this will become a lot easier as the capacity you gain from Architect Penumbra continues to increase. So he is basically a backliner you put behind a strong Gorge unit to have some additional damage and by the end some additional space to work with as well. Next up is Monstrous. Monstrous starts with a very high stat line of 40-25. He always comes with Trample, and sometimes it can be useful to take 1 upgrade in Monstrous just to get the Trample. And he increases his capacity need to 4. Further upgrades in Monstrous increase his stats significantly, but they also increase the capacity he needs to 5 and finally 6. So the final Penumbra, Monstrous Penumbra, requires you to pick up some amount of extra space, be it a boss relic or maybe one of the Umbra relics or cards that give capacity. Usually you want it to be an artifact. Most of the time it will be a boss artifact because that guarantees you can play Penumbra on the floor of your choosing, while the other option is normal option is mind checks, which will only allow you to play Penumbra on the middle floor. That said, he's a very strong unit by himself. His stat line is almost enough to take out a frontline unit of the current tier by himself. And with his trample, he is a very good cleanup unit. You can put behind your main frontline killing floor and clean up all the remaining backliners easily thanks to the trample. With his high HP, he doesn't really need much help to survive in the later stages of the game, but in the early stages he can still be quite fragile. Finally, there's the Glutton path. Glutton gives him lifesteal 2, no matter the stage. This won't increase as you upgrade him, nor will his base stats. The only thing that increases is his Gorge ability. On stage 1 he will gain +3 attack and +1 health whenever he eats a morsel. This will double to 6 attack and 2 health, and double again to 12 attack and 4 health on the final stage. This Penumbra is clearly meant to be a boss killer, frontline killer, um, mostly a boss killer though, because he needs a little bit of time to grow strong enough to actually kill frontline units. So he's mostly meant as a boss killer. His lifesteal will be enough in the early game with his decent basal stat line of 2020 to keep him alive long enough to grow, but in the later stages he might need some help because 20 health can get one shot before he has a chance to lifesteal all that back. Um, yeah, so these are the champion upgrade paths. Next I want to look at the cards, because the cards are what allows us to rate these champions on what roles they can perform in the clan. So let's first start with the morsels. These small little guys are created by a bunch of Umbra cards. The basic card and many other cards in the game create morsels, and almost every unit in the Umbra clan interacts with morsels in some way. So the common one is Rubble Morsel. Rubble Morsel can only be generated by the basic card Shade Splitter. No other card will ever generate Rubble Morsels. These small little things can be used as jump blockers to tank damage, and of course they can be used for their Eaten ability, which gains you 1 Ember, usually in the next turn, because they will be eaten at the end of combat, so you will have the 1 Ember available next turn. These are usually not too useful, but at times they can be helpful. Uh, Sometimes you want the Ember next turn. Oftentimes you don't really need the Ember generated by the Rubble Morsels, and will instead just play them for Gorge abilities. Gorge is an effect that triggers whenever a morsel gets eaten. Uh, let's talk about the Eaten ability real quick. Because this is going to be key to understand these morsels. So Eaten means that at the end of combat, if the morsel survives and there is a unit on the floor that is not a morsel, any unit that is not a morsel on the same floor, then the Rubble Morsel will die and it will trigger its Eaten effect, which is gain 1 Ember. Um, for the Rubble Morsel, it doesn't matter in some cases which unit eats it, but the other morsels have an effect that will affect their eater. So let's look at the Antumbra morsel. Eater gains +3 health, so it will be eaten by the front non-morsel unit, so the one that's all the way to the front, not the one in front of the Rubble Morsel, of the morsel. It will be eaten by the one that's all the way to the front. And that unit will get +3 health. So only the frontmost unit in every floor can eat morsels. This is very important to understand Umbra. Only the front unit can ever eat morsels. So only the front unit can ever trigger their Gorge abilities. Um, Let's look at Gorge real quick. Again, Gorge is triggers when this unit eats a morsel unit. So whenever a unit eats a morsel unit, it will trigger their gorge effect. So that means you can on every floor only have one unit triggering the gorge effect and triggering the eaten effect of morsels. So we have four uncommon morsels. These can be generated by the basic card of Umbra, the Shade Splitter, but they are a bit more rare than the Rubble morsel. But most other cards will generate these uncommon morsels. We have an Umbra morsel, which is a 0/4, and the eater gains +3 health. Being a 0/4 can sometimes make them able to tank a hit and still survive. That's not too often the case, but if it is the case, you might want to do that just to save some health on your Gorger, and that can be nice. Other than that, this just provides very light health scaling, which can be nice to keep your unit healthy during combat, keep them away from dying, or just get them enough health to deal with the boss. Relentless combat. Next up, Magma Morsel. This morsel is a 3/1 and the ether gains +3 attack. So this one can attack, which also means it can die to spikes. So be careful when you deploy magma morsels. Make sure there's no spikes on that floor, and if there are, make sure the units that act before the magma morsel, so the units in front of it, will kill the spike unit first, otherwise the magma morsel will very easily die to the spikes. It can also be used to kill things like collectors or even backline units with up to 3 HP. So these guys can actually be quite helpful and are very often useful just to kill backliners and things like that. Of course, the attack scaling it gives are nice to be better prepared against future waves, to kill frontline units a bit more easily, and especially to get enough attack to deal with the relentless phase of the boss. Next up, Morsel Excavator. Now we get to the juicy parts. This morsel is a 2/1 with who gives the eater +2 attack and lifesteal 1. What this means is if the unit survives this round of combat, it can eat the morsel excavator, and then if it survives the next combat, it can lifesteal back health. So very often, if you get a morsel excavator, you are looking to feed it to a unit that will have health problems coming up in a few turns and needs a full heal, but isn't about to die in the next 1 or 2 turns, otherwise the lifesteal won't be enough to save them. Um, of course, there's also the option of stacking up lifesteal. If you stack enough lifesteal, then you will basically be immune to any damage the boss does to you or anyone does to you, because you will just heal to full after every combat. You attack, trigger the lifesteal, and usually most units will have enough attack to heal back to full. So the lifesteal is definitely very powerful. Um, One thing with lifesteal is it comes in stacks. This one gives lifesteal 1, and whenever you attack, you restore health equal to the damage dealt and lose 1 stack of lifesteal. This also means multi-strike unit will use up their charges of lifesteal faster. So keep that in mind. There are some units that utilize lifesteal, and there are some units that utilize multi-strike in Umbra. So these can conflict a little bit. Other than that, you can't lifesteal when you hit a damage shield, obviously, because you deal no damage. But a bit more common and unintuitive is you can't lifesteal off of armor. If there is a frontline guy that has armor, then you will lifesteal significantly less because you can't lifesteal off the damage you deal to armor. So if let's say our monstrous Penumbra with lifesteal. The Penumbra is a 170 attack unit, hits an enemy unit with 100 armor. He will only be able to lifesteal for 70 health because 100 damage gets blocked by the armor and you can't lifesteal off that damage. You can lifesteal off overkill damage, so if you hit like a 1 health unit for 100 damage, you will still lifesteal 100, even if you don't have trample or anything like that. That still works. These morsels are usually some of the best ones you can roll from the basic cards, and they are very useful from anything that generates uncommon morsels most of the time. Just because lifesteal is such a powerful effect, you can just use one stack of lifesteal to instantly heal anything to full, given it survives long enough to make use of the lifesteal. Next up, Morsel Jeweler. This one is a 0-2 and it gives the Eater +1 health and damage shield 1. That means the next hit they will take will be negated. So it will only negate one source of damage, no matter what source that is. For example, if you hit a unit with spikes 2, when you have a damage shield, you will negate these 2 damage and you will lose a damage shield. And if a unit with multi-strike attacks your damage shielded unit, then you will lose multiple instances of damage shield, one for each attack the enemy does. So damage shield is a bit weaker than lifesteal against the multi-strike bosses like Fel, Seraph and Self-Made Harpy. But it can be a bit more proactive, which is nice because you don't need to survive the attacks first. Instead, you get to block the damage right away. So the Morsel Jewelers are a bit better in saving units that are really close to dying and would die after the next round of combat maybe. And these give you time to get something like lifesteal or maybe a little bit extra health with an Antumbra morsel, and they even provide a small amount of health themselves. So these guys can be very useful as well because they allow you to save uh, wounded units, and if you stack enough damage shield, nothing can ever hurt you. It can be tough to get enough damage shield to uh, tank something like a Self-Made Harpy for a bunch of turns, but enemies that attack only once can be easily tanked with a unit with a bunch of damage shield on them. Next up is the only rare morsel, the Morsel Miner. Rare morsels cannot be generated by Shade Splitter, the basic Umbra card, so you will never see a Morsel Miner from Shade Splitter. But most other morsel generating cards do have a chance to generate Morsel Miners. They are, however, a bit more rare than the uncommon ones. There's also a card that specifically generates a Morsel Miner, so that's the most reliable way of getting them. These just give the Eater a huge amount of stats, +5/+5, which is a pretty significant buff. And other than that, not much to say. They have a 0-1 stat line, so they are very vulnerable. So yeah, don't put them in the front because it would be a waste to jump block with Morsel Miners. Even though there are certain circumstances where you have no other options to than to do that to keep your unit alive, maybe to get their lifesteal off, and in that case it can be worth even throwing a valuable Morsel Miner away. So I talked quite a bit about the basic card of Umbra, which is the Shade Splitter. The Shade Splitter is a 1 mana card that gives that generates you a common or uncommon morsel unit to your hand. Um, because there is a pretty high chance that it will generate the common rubble morsel, this card is often not that great, but it will be your early game morsel generation you can rely on because you will always have 3 to 5 of these cards in your deck. If you have great uses for morsels or want a bunch of morsel generation in your deck, sometimes it can be okay to leave these shade splitters in the deck, but usually you want to replace them with better morsel generating cards as your run goes on. And once you have better morsel generating cards, feel free to cut these shade splitters from your deck, just because the morsels they provide tend to be not as valuable and they only generate a single morsel, which is not an amazing deal. So let's look at the common cards Umbra has available. These common cards, you will find them from combats, after combat rewards. Um, you will find these cards. You cannot find these common cards in unit banners, obviously because none of them are units. So these cards are common enough that you can rely on getting one of them during your run, maybe not early, but usually you will be able to find a certain card. So if you think your deck will eventually need an Entumbra Soul to generate morsels and deal with backliners, then there's a good chance you will find an Entumbra Soul sooner or later. Um, so let's look at these cards. Mind Collapse first. Mind Collapse is a X cost card that deals damage to an enemy unit. In fact, it deals 3 times X damage. And if it kills a unit, you trigger the Slay and gain back 2 Ember. This is not a terrible card, because it can deal with higher HP backlines as well as lower HP backlines, and it can give you the energy you spent on it back, or even more than that. If you play it for 1 energy, kill a 3 or less HP target, then you will get back 2 energy anyways, so you actually gained an energy by playing the card, which is a nice benefit. Another thing you can do is put a Power Stone on it, which will grant it plus 10 magic power. Then even if you cast it for 0, it will deal 10 damage. And if you slay something with it, you can generate 2 Ember off of it. Just keep in mind that you can't use those Ember generated by Mind Collapse to play more expensive cards, because you will lose all your Ember when you play this card. So only play it at the very end to generate 2 more Ember to play your other cards. Otherwise, it might mess up your plans. If necessary, you can play it for more energy to deal with something like a frontline unit if you have a lot of energy or the frontline unit is significantly weakened already, but that's not usually a very great use of Mind Collapse. Its primary use is definitely killing backlines for low energy cost and getting that energy or even a bit more than that back. If I'm looking for a way to deal with backlines or to play more cards in a single turn, maybe I have a bunch of semi-expensive cards and then I want to play a few one-cost cards after them, then Mind Collapse might help me do that. So it's a kind of average card. It's not amazing, it isn't terrible either. I will usually pick up a Mind Collapse early if I see one and I don't have a good way of single targeting down critical enemies that need to die, or generally a good way of dealing with backlines, then in these scenarios it's absolutely fine to pick up a mine collapse, but most of the time there are better solutions to that problem. Next up, Prismal Dust. Prismal Dust is an X cost, again, consume count that applies 1x damage shield to one unit of your choice. This can be a decently powerful effect against bosses especially, because these can prolong the fight very well. But all in all, I think Prismal Dust is just a bit too expensive to use in most decks. If I really need something like Prismal Dust to defend my units, um, my deck has some inherent flaws. But Prismal Dust can serve the purpose of protecting my units, sometimes against critical wave, sometimes against the boss, until I find a better, more reliable, more efficient way of doing that. It's almost always wrong to rely on Prismal Dust of doing that job for you, unless you have a very specific artifact, which can be very powerful with certain Umbra card, and that artifact is the first Hell Pact. X cost cards get +3 to their X value when played. If you happen to have a first Hell Pact, then Prismal Dust becomes actually quite strong, because it allows you to generate 3 damage shields for 0 mana, which is a very good deal. And in case you have leftover embers, then you can scale that effect up even more. All in all, I try to avoid Prismal Dust as much as I can, but sometimes in very specific circumstances it can come in handy, and if I have them in the starting deck, I often try to find a use where they can come in handy and can protect my units. But if I can't find such a use, I will not hesitate to play it for 0 just to consume it out of my deck so I don't have to draw into it again. All in all, I think Prismal Dust is one of the weaker cards in Umbra and only really shines if you have the first Hell Pact. Next up, we have Immortal Trade. Immortal Trade is our first card with the mechanic Ember Drain. It's a 0 cost spell that applies Lifesteal 3, which is quite powerful, and it also applies Ember Drain 2 as a downside. Ember Drain means at the start of your next turn, you lose 1 Ember for every stack of Ember Drain on any of your units. And then each of your units decreases their Ember Drain count by 1. So if you play Mortal Trade on one of your units, that means you will be down 2 mana next turn and 1 mana the turn after that. And then the Ember Drain will have run out and you will get your full amount of Ember again. So this is a quite significant downside. Basically, you are paying 3 Ember for this card to get Lifesteal 3, and that's quite expensive. So oftentimes it is not very strong if you actually have the negative effect of Ember Drain. But there are quite a few ways to mitigate the effect of Ember Drain, or even dodge it completely, basically. There is an archetype in Umbra that is about using Ember Drain cards a lot on the same unit even, maybe stacking Ember Drain very high. Because once you're at the 3 or 4 Ember Drain, it really stops mattering. If you have 4 Ember Drain, you will usually have no Ember at all during your turn. So why not go up to 100 Ember Drain instead? It doesn't change the amount of Ember you will have available. So Ember Drain is a mechanic that is very synergistic with itself, because most Ember Drain cards are 0 cost, so you can play them if you're Ember Drained, and if you have a certain amount of Ember Drain, future Ember Drain won't matter. And these Ember Drain cards are all very powerful. So let's look at Immortal Trade. Sometimes it is actually worth paying 3 Ember to apply Lifesteal 3 to save one of your units, a critical unit. For example, your champion is about to get really low and maybe die in the next combat. So you want the lifesteal to keep your champion alive, heal him back up, and he will continue to heal back up for 2 more turns. That's quite powerful. Yes, you might have reduced Ember to deal with during the next 2 turns, but maybe that's worth it. Then also, if the boss comes around and relentless combat will begin, either you will win or all your units will die. And if your Ember Drain unit is dead, then you don't have the negatives of Ember Drain. So you can put that on any unit in the boss combat to prolong their lifespan thanks to the lifesteal, and then either you win and don't need any more Ember, or the unit dies and you don't get the negatives of Ember Drain. So that's why Immortal Trade can be very powerful. It's a very powerful boss killing tool because Lifesteal 3 usually means you will survive for 3 more turns in relentless combat. And that's usually a huge amount of damage dealt. And sometimes it can just save you a critical unit that would lose you the entire fight if you lost it. So Immortal Trade, a very strong card, but it can sometimes be really hard to use. If you have to use it early and have to deal with the Ember Drain effects, maybe you miss out on scaling. So there are definitely downsides, and I will be very careful whether or not I take the Immortal Trade or not. Oftentimes, if I start with Immortal Trades in my deck, I might consider going for an Ember Drain build, especially if Monstrous Umbra is available as a champion. So, yep, that's Immortal Trade. Next up, Packed Morsels. Packed Morsels is a very powerful card in my opinion because it is 0 cost and adds 3 random uncommon or rare morsel units to your hand. 3 morsels is quite a bit and can be enough to fill an entire floor behind your Gorger with morsels. It's enough to trigger the Gorge abilities a bunch of times, and Pack Morsels has a decent chance of giving you one of these life-saving morsels, the life steal or damage shield ones, so they can be helpful to save your units as well. On top of all that, this card is a 0 cost card, which means you can easily play it even if you're Ember Drained, for example, or if you have other important things to play. It's also a pretty big amount of morsels for a single card, so it can help you in the early game when you're looking to get your Gorge triggers up to deal with the first few waves. It does consume, but that's okay. Usually the first few morsels you eat are the most important ones. For all of these reasons, I will almost never turn down a packed morsels unless morsels aren't part of my strategy at all, which is very rarely the case with Umbra. Almost never. But other than that, I will usually pick up every packed morsels I see, unless I need another card, more importantly. But packed morsels definitely a powerful card. Next up, another Ember Drain card, and that's Perils of Production. Perils is a 0 cost card that applies Rage 2 and Ember Drain 2 to a friendly unit, and then it gains you 2 Ember. So the Rage 2 is nice but not a big deal. The main benefit of Perils of Production is definitely the Ember gain, the immediate Ember gain from it. So for the cost of losing 3 Embers during the next 2 turns, you gain 2 Ember this turn. Doesn't that sound like a bad trade-off? It probably is most of the time if you play this card on a full unit. If you, however, play this card on a morsel that gets eaten at the end of turn, you will gain these 2 embers without having to deal with the negative of Ember Drain. So that's one use of Perils of Production you can do in almost every Umbra deck. If you are using morsels, you can play Perils of Production on one of your morsels, gain 2 energy, and let it get eaten and not deal with the Ember Drain. It even gains some rage, so it might deal some damage. Be careful with spikes though, you don't want your morsel to accidentally attack into spikes and die and not be around to get eaten. Another thing with this card is, if you already have a bunch of Ember Drain stacked, you will not generate Ember at the start of your turn, but you can play Perils of Production to generate Ember. So Perils of Production is an important piece in a full out Ember Drain deck because it can allow you to play cards that actually cost Ember. You can play a Perils of Production, get 2 Ember, and just play out the cards you want, even though you are under very heavy Ember Drain. The Rage 2 is usually a less important aspect of this card, but it can sometimes be helpful to keep other sources of Rage up or just give a little bit of extra damage, but most of the time it won't really matter all that much. So Perils of Production is a very strong card if you can use the Ember it provides, otherwise try to avoid it. If you're going for a full Ember Drain build, or if you have cards that benefit from a lot of Ember on a single turn, X-Cost cards for example, then Perils of Production can be very powerful indeed. Next up, Space Prism. Space Prism is in my opinion the best support card Umbra has. If I am playing a heavy non-Umbra deck and Umbra is my secondary clan, Space Prism is what I'm looking for most from Umbra. It's a 0-cost card that gives you +1 capacity on a floor and consumes. Because it is 0 cost, it is very easy to play out. Just increase the size of the floor you want, and suddenly you can play more morsels, more imps, more totems, more channelers, or even a full-sized unit, maybe another drag, another draft. There are so many ways to use this +1 capacity in all the other clans that this card is amazing. But even if you are playing Umbra as your main force, let's say you're playing Umbra Woken and you don't really want to use many of the Woken cards and are mostly playing with Umbra cards, Umbra units and things like that, then Space Prism will usually serve one purpose and one purpose only. It makes space for one more morsel to be put on this floor. That is still pretty strong. After all, this is a common 0-cost card. Space Prism can in some decks totally remove your need of picking boss artifacts that increase capacity. So for that reason, Space Prism is a very powerful card. I'm always happy if I'm starting out with 2 Space Prisms as my starting cards, and I will often take a Space Prism when I see one. I will take multiple Space Prisms in many runs, maybe up to 3, or maybe even dupe them 5 times if I don't have a great upgraded spell to dupe. I think 6 Space Prisms are normally a bit too many, but they do consume out of your deck, and usually you can find a use for most of them at the very least. So Space Prism all in all, just a generally very good card. There's almost always a use for extra capacity on your floor, unless you overdo it and run into the unit limit of maximum 7 units on a floor, but other than that, Space Prism will almost always be great for you. Next up, Antumbra Assault. This is another card that generates morsels, and this one does it by slaying enemies. It's a one-cost card that deals 3 damage. If you slay an unit with that, you gain 2 uncommon or rare morsel units from it. Most combats do have some low health units in almost every wave, but not literally every wave. Some waves do consist of uh, only frontline or tanky units, but these are very rare. There's almost always something to slay with Antumbra Assault, especially in the early game. By the mid game, you might want to upgrade Antumbra Assault to deal plus 10 damage with a Power Stone, so it can slay 5 or 10 health backliners and sometimes be used on damaged frontline units as well. I think Entumbra Assault is a very powerful card because it's another good card to deal with backline units in Umbra, and there are not that many ways to do that. There are a few, there are a bunch even, but Entumbra Assault is in my opinion one of the better ones. When I have Entumbra Assault, I am looking to put Holdover on it, and I am looking to put spell damage on it. Reduction can also be quite powerful on Antumbra Assault, and very often Antumbra Assault is one of the first cards I upgrade in my deck. Because for 1 Ember, generating 2 morsels and taking out the backline unit is just extremely efficient. So I think Antumbra Assault is a strong card, but keep in mind that you can't use too many of them. There will only be so many enemy units with 3 or less health, or maybe 13 or less health if you give it spell power. Um, and if you can't generate morsels with it, that also means you can't kill anything with it, so it becomes a lot worse. In times like these, you can use them on your own units, train stewards, other morsels, just to generate the morsels, and even then it's still a decent card. It's not terrible. You play one of your morsels, you play Antumbra Assault on it, you get 2 morsels back. That's basically what a Shade Splitter does, but Antumbra Assault gives you better quality morsels, and it allows you to uh, remove your weakest morsel from the pool and basically re-roll it. So if you have a rubble morsel, you can't really do much with it, then play the rubble morsel, play Antumbra Assault on it, and you will be guaranteed to get 2 better morsels, because this one guarantees uncommon or rare morsel units. So Antumbra Assault, definitely one of the stronger commons in Umbra's suit, but don't take too many of them because there won't always be targets. Especially there's one fight, the Light Harnessers, where only 35 health units and some tanks will spawn. And on a fight like that, Antumbra Assault obviously becomes a lot worse because there's nothing to reliably slay with it. But that's one combat only. Pretty much every combat other than that in the game will have targets for Antumbra Assault, and so I rate it very highly. Finally, the final card in Umbra's common is Making of a Morsel. Making of a Morsel is a 2-cost spell that guarantees a morsel miner. It simply adds 1 morsel miner to your hand and that's it. Personally, I think a single morsel miner is usually not worth 2 Ember. But there are a few ways to duplicate the morsel miner, so that's something you can do. And if you are playing Melting Remnant as your other clan, you might be able to reform your morsel miners and get a lot of value out of any excess reforms you don't need for your main units, because you can use them to reform morsel miners and give those permanent stat boosts to your unit. If I start with making of a morsel, I'm very often looking at keeping them because they are quite decent, and cost reducing them because 2 mana on a single morsel is a lot to play, even though it's the best, most powerful morsel unit available, the morsel minor, but still 2 mana to spend on it is a lot. So I will often avoid this card and look for other morsel generations, but sometimes it can be worth picking up 1 or 2 making of a morsel, maybe cost reducing them. Even cost reduced holdover on this card isn't terrible, but oftentimes I prefer other morsel generators. So these are the commons in Umbra. You can see there are 3 major themes here. There's morsel generation, there's Ember Drain cards, and there are X-Cost cards. And finally there's Space Prism, which is just generally useful. So the common X-Cost cards aren't very good. So maybe there are some better ones in uncommon, and to be fair, not really. We will find some good X-Cost cards later on though. Now let's look at the uncommon cards. First up, there's Prism Retrieval. Prism Retrieval is an X-Cost card with Consume that draws a unit from your deck. If your deck has no units left in it, from your draw pile instead. And it will enhance the unit with plus 5x attack and minus x amber cost. So usually you can play the unit after you prism retrieval it. So basically this is a poor man's channel song. It also grabs the unit from your deck, it also sometimes makes it free, and it gives it a bunch of attack but no health. So it's oftentimes a worse channel song. That said, channel song is a rare, so there's a good reason maybe it's a bit stronger. But prism retrieval mainly serves one purpose. If you have a bunch of units you want to set up, or if your units are not guaranteed draw units, which actually is usually not the case in Umbra because all of Umbra's units are guaranteed draw units. Then prism retrieval becomes good. So let's talk about these guaranteed draw units real quick. At the start of every turn, the first card you will draw is a unit. Until you have seen every unit in your deck at least once. And some units are excluded from that. These are the imps, the drags, the train stewards, the drafts, any channelers from Awoken, all totems except the rare ones from Stygian, and Spike Driver colonies from the Clanless cards, as well as tombs from Melting Remnant. These are not guaranteed draw units. So a Prism Retrieval can help you fetch these units that aren't guaranteed draw units to set them up earlier. For example, you can find your Totem if you are Stygian as your secondary clan, or your Channeler if you are Awoken secondary clan. You can also use it to play your guaranteed draw units earlier, but the main problem of that card is it's random. It might get you a Train Steward. You might not be happy about that. Oftentimes, if I see a prism retrieval, I will avoid it because there's not that much use for it in Umbra, and generally it's not a great card in most decks. But sometimes it does have a use. It becomes significantly better if you have the first Hell Pact, because then it's guaranteed to be plus 15 attack and minus 3 Ember cost, so you can use it to play additional units. If you have already spent all your mana and you want to play another unit, you can play Prism Retrieval for 0 with the first Hell Pact and still play a unit that costs up to 3 Ember, and it even gets a nice attack buff. So it's not all bad. You can oftentimes also just use it to draw a unit and maybe and just consume the spell, maybe not even play the unit. At least you won't draw it later until you reshuffle your deck, or you can just play it for one. Maybe you draw a Train Steward and play it out. It's not bad. Basically, it consumes, it draws you a card, so it's never really dead weight in your deck. But it is very rarely great. So for that reason, I'm not very sad if I see Prism Retrieval in my starting deck, but I will almost never pick one up later. Next up, Embocage. This is a very interesting card. It's a zero cost card that consumes, once again, Umbra seems to have a bunch of these. And then it adds 3 excavated embers to your deck. These excavated embers are actually clanless cards. These are consume, gain 2 ember, draw 1. Zero cost spells. So Embocage puts them into your discard pile. So you will not start drawing these right away, you will only get them in your next shuffle of your deck. So it is very delayed Ember gain. Sometimes that can still be useful. If you have a bunch of X-cost cards in your deck, these excavated embers can give you a nice chunk of ember generation, and they will replace themselves as well. Um, if you have any artifacts that care about you consuming cards, for example, Traitor's Quill, when a card with consume is played, deals 30 damage to the front enemy units, or Refracting Lenses, when a card with consume is played, restore 5 pyre health, then these excavated embers become actually quite powerful. Another use of these is if you're playing with Stygian. Every one of these excavated embers is an incant trigger, and they replace themselves, they give you energy, so they will increase the amount of spells you will be playing in a single turn by quite a bit. Finally, against Consume Seraph, you can use this card to trigger the first consume as the first spell to trigger the consume, so your other cards won't be consumed. And if you draw into Excavated Embers, you can use them the same way. And last but not least, probably one of the most important uses of these cards, if you are playing a heavy Ember Drain deck and you don't have any Embers, then these excavated Embers can be real lifesavers because they allow you to generate some Ember to play your cards. So very often, if I am facing any of these situations, then I will pick up an Ember Cache, and if I find one early, I might just pick it up just for the chance to go Ember Drain later. But if you don't really have a good use for the Ember those excavated Embers generate, then this card is not very good. Because while all of these excavated Embers do draw you a card when you play them, the Ember Cache itself doesn't, so the Ember Cache is basically a dead draw. You draw it, you play it, it has no immediate effect, and then if you can't really make use of the excavated embers, then the effect the Ember Cache has was not very impactful. But there are a variety of situations where these excavated embers are actually real good, and so the Ember Cache does have a lot of potential. Next up, Feast. Feast is a zero cost card that triggers feeding on morsel units. That means all your morsel units on this floor will immediately get eaten by the front unit and trigger their eaten effect and the eater's gorge effects appropriately. So what Feast does is it allows you to empty your floor to play another set of morsels to normally eat after combat. It can help you with applying the morsel buffs before combat starts. It can even help you against sweep or spikes if the morsels you want to eat are threatened to die during combat. Feast can prevent that by having your Gorge unit eat them before the combat even starts. I think Feast is a very overrated card and will rarely pick it up. Now, why is that? So for Feast to be useful in most situations, you need to have a plethora of morsel generating cards. Usually, if you generate 2 or 3 morsels a turn, that's a decent amount, and you can just play them out on your floor and have them be eaten at the end of combat. If you generate more than that, let's say if you generate 6 morsels in a single turn, then you might want a feast. But usually to generate 6 morsels in a single turn, that means you have 3 cards that generate morsels. So you need to have a lot of draw to actually make use of feast, because feast needs to be in the same hand as a lot of morsel generation. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a single feast in your deck if you have a lot of morsel generation. In fact, it might be very beneficial, but try to avoid having too many feasts, because feasts will actually reduce the amount of morsel generation you get in your average hand, because feast doesn't generate any morsels. And if you have a hand with 2 feasts and only 2 morsel generate, only the capability of generating 2 morsels, these feasts are basically dead cards. Not saying that feast is actually a bad card. It's still a okay card, and it can help you with some situations like sweep or sometimes spikes that can make feeding morsels to your unit a lot harder. But please be careful with feast. It will actually decrease the amount of morsels you will be able to generate, because feast is not a morsel generating card, and it depends on having morsel generating cards in the same hand. That said, if you are going for the glutton penumbra path, that is the one with gorge gain stats, then feast becomes a bit better, because you very often will want to use feast early on to get these stats for the combat that is about to begin, instead of getting the stats after said combat. Especially important for the first 1 or 2 combats, when your penumbra might not be big enough yet to kill the enemy frontline, but maybe with a feast that can happen. So if I have very high morsel generation, or if I feel like sweep or spikes would screw me over, or if I need my gorge penumbra to grow faster, then 1 or at maximum 2 feasts are decent pickups. Other than that, I will most of the time pass on feast. Maybe that's also because my play style, usually I play Umbra on 2 floors and have 2 gorge units eating morsels. So feast is a lot less necessary for that kind of playstyle. As instead, if you are using only a single floor and eat all the morsels on that single floor, then feast is a bit better, because you reach the capacity limit on that single floor very easily. Next up, Void Binding. Void Binding is an extremely powerful zero-cost card that applies Damage Shield 2, Rage 6, and Ember Drain 3. So Ember Drain 3 means if you play this card normally you pay 6 mana for it, which is an insane price to pay for that card. That's only really worth it if these damage shields actually save your unit from immediate death. But there are, as I've said before, a bunch of ways to make Void Binding work a lot better. If you have a morsel unit in front of your main unit that you want to protect, then you can play Void Binding on the morsel, give it 2 damage shield. It tanks 2 more hits. Maybe this allows the morsel to survive, hit the enemy with Rage 6, it's not insignificant, and finally get eaten, so the Ember Drain disappears. So for these reasons, Void Binding can be decent in any deck that uses morsels. You can use it to protect your units from a bunch of damage and deal some damage as well with Rage. Now, the more broken way of using Void Binding is in a full Ember Drain deck. If you don't really rely on generating Ember in your deck, and I know that might seem crazy, but decks like that do exist, then Void Binding becomes ridiculous. Applying Rage 6 is basically Ritual of Battle, which is a 3-cost card, and applying Damage Shield 2 is basically a Prismal Dust for 2. So you're basically getting 5 Ember worth of value from this card for free. Well, basically free, because after all, you're not using Ember anyway, are we? So the only thing that really matters is the card. So you're getting Rage 6 and Damage Shield 2 from a single card. That's an insane amount of power for a single card. If I have Void Binding as the starting card in my deck, I will very much try to go for an Ember Drain build because it is probably the strongest single card to have in an Ember Drain deck that you want to play commonly. If I'm playing a deck that uses a lot of Ember Drain, I will try to double stack and hold over the Void Binding. Yes, double stack will affect the Ember Drain as well, but we don't care. We don't use Ember. Well, except for maybe the one we generate with Perils of Production or Ember Cache. Things like that might still allow us to include some cards that actually cost Ember in our deck. So Void Binding, insanely powerful, but it does have the drawback that it's very hard to use if you rely on your normal Ember generation to play your card. Then it's very often only really playable on morsels or during Relentless Combat. It's still very strong during Relentless Combat, not quite as strong as the Immortal trait, the Lifesteal one, because Damage Shield 2 is a bit weaker than Lifesteal 3, but it makes up for that with the damage scaling in Rage. And if I have a Void Binding I want to play regularly, the Rage from Perils of Production becomes more important, just to keep up the Rage the Void Binding applies. So Void Binding, one of the strongest Umbra cards, but one that is very limited in use to a very specific deck or certain specific situations in any deck. Next up is Cannibalize. Cannibalize is a 1-cost card with Sacrifice. Add 3 random uncommon or rare morsel units to your hand. Sacrifice means you have to kill a friendly unit to play the card. You target any of your units, you sacrifice it, you gain 3 morsels. Now in Umbra, the unit you are targeting with Cannibalize will most of the time be a morsel or Train Steward sometimes. And if you target a morsel with Cannibalize, it's basically 1 cost, add 2 random uncommon or rare morsel units to your hand. Except that you also get to reroll a morsel. Same concept as with Entumbra Assault. So Cannibalize basically is Entumbra Assault on your own units, but it always slays, always kills the target, and generates an additional morsel. I think it's a very strong card because it allows you to select your morsels a bit better, and generating 3 morsels with a single card is very powerful. And even if you target a morsel with it, 2 morsels for 1 card is still quite good. It becomes a bit better if you are playing Hellhound or Melting Remnant. Hellhound, you often have these imps that have powerful effects when you play them, but then they sit around taking up capacity. Maybe they don't die immediately. You cannibalize them, great value. You get some morsels out of them, and you get rid of them at the same time. In Melting Remnant, there are a variety of uses for this card. There are way too many uses to discuss all of them, but sometimes you want to sacrifice your extinguish unit to trigger their extinguish right away. Sometimes you want to sacrifice your burnout unit because you want to reform it, or because the burnout makes it die at the wrong time and you want to play another unit instead. There are many ways to utilize Cannibalize in Melting Remnant, so this is one of the cards that synergizes a lot with Melting Remnant, but is also decent in any other situations where you generate morsels and want to have more morsels. Keep in mind it might be a bit hard to use Cannibalize if you don't have any morsels out, because you will need to sacrifice a unit. Maybe you have a Trame Steward, but if you don't, it's probably not worth it to sacrificing a full value unit to cannibalize, unless that unit would die anyways. So Cannibalize, I think, definitely a very valuable card, one I will often pick up if I need more morsel generation, but I already have a bunch. Um, but if I have very low morsel generation, I'm less likely to pick up Cannibalize, because I usually rely on having a morsel out to play Cannibalize. Another thing to keep in mind, if you have Cannibalize in your deck, it might be useful to play any leftover morsels you generate on an empty floor, just to keep them around so you can cannibalize them later for use on your actual main floors. Next up, Engine Upgrade. Engine Upgrade is a very unique card. It costs 1 Ember, consumes. It reduces the capacity of a floor by 1 and gives you +1 Ember per turn for the rest of combat, rest of the battle. So, by sacrificing a single capacity on 1 floor, you gain basically a whole boss artifact worth of power, +1 Ember for the rest of the battle per turn. That's a powerful effect, and if you have a deck that has a bunch of mid to high cost cards, Engine Upgrade is certainly worth a pickup. Keep in mind you generate the Ember at the start of your turn, so you can't avoid Ember Drain effects with that. The Ember Drain will take the Ember generated by Engine Upgrade away, the same as it would normally generated Ember. So you can't use it to circumvent Ember Drain, but other than that, it's an amazing card if you have 1 floor you are not using, because reducing the capacity on the floor can be a bit of an issue. So the main downside of Engine Upgrade is that basically you need to have a floor you're not using, but you are very rarely gonna be using all 3 floors, so Engine Upgrade should usually be fine. I will take Engine Upgrade whenever I feel like I can use the Ember. Uh, you need to draw Engine Upgrade first, so you can't really rely on it to play your early game units. So if you, for example, want to play something like a 6 cost unit, or let's say a Demon Fiend. Let's say you want to play a Demon Fiend and your only way of generating Ember is Engine Upgrade. That might not work out because Demon Fiend is a priority draw, so you will draw it relatively early, oftentimes in your first hand. And if you have Engine Upgrade as your energy generator, then you won't get to play Demon Fiend in your first hand, and maybe not even your second, because that requires you have Engine Upgrade in your opening hand, which can only have 3 spells, because you draw your champion and you draw your guaranteed minion draw. So that's a little bit of an issue, but if you use Engine Upgrade just to play more cards every turn, then that works just fine, and Engine Upgrade is a great pickup. Next up, Cave-In. Cave-In descends all friendly and all enemy units from one floor to the floor below it. These units will not care about the capacity in the floor, but they will care about the unit maximum in the floor. So you can only have 7 units friendlies and 7 units enemies on a floor. So if Cave-In would uh, go over that maximum, the units that don't fit on the bottom floor will stay on the top floor. I'm not entirely sure uh, which units will stay on the floor. I think the um, the ones further in the back will be descended first, but I could be wrong about that. Um, but usually Cave-In has 3 users. You can use it if you're not heavy in Umbra to overstack floors, have powerful killing floors. This strategy doesn't work very well in Umbra, because usually you need some space in your floor to play your morsels to feed the frontline units, and if you overstack the floor too hard then with Cave-In, then you don't have any capacity left to play morsels on that floor, so that's a bit of an issue. What you can do, however, is you can play morsels on a floor above the one you are planning to feed them to, and then descend the morsels into your floor, and this way ignore the capacity of the floor you want to feed these morsels on. Finally, oftentimes if you are looking to get a good score, for example in a Hell Rush or a daily challenge, Cave-In can move your floor down to meet the boss, and because it descends the entire floor and not just a single unit, you will often be able to set up your killing floor on the second floor, and then Cave-In when the boss comes up to kill him on the bottom floor and get the 3-turn boss rush bonus. It can in a similar way be used on flying bosses to bring them down a floor, and of course you can use them to descend enemies that have gone past your main floor back down to your floor, but that's a bit dangerous because that floor might then be very deadly to your units. So Cave-In, I will pick that up in most daily challenges or hell rushes just to get that extra score off of it. And other than that, it depends a lot on how my build looks. If I can make use of the overstacking capability Cave-In provides, then it's great. If I can't and just use it for morsels, then it's maybe not so great. But it can still work sometimes if I have a lot of morsel generation but not a lot of capacity on the floor I want to feed the morsels to. Cave-In is a very situational card. You need to look at your deck. In some decks and in some situations Cave-In is amazing and you want to hold over it or permafrost it. In other decks you really better not have a Cave-In in your deck in the first place. Next up, Crucible Extension. Crucible Extension is basically Space Prism, just for 2 energy more, but it doesn't consume. So it's a 2 energy card that gives you +1 capacity on the floor. That's nice. It does cost 2 embers, so that's a little bit restrictive. It will often be a large part of what you do in any given turn. but it does serve the same purpose as a Space Prism. Generally, I prefer Space Prism over Crucible Extension, but you can also cost reduce Crucible Extension, maybe even 2 times, and use it repeatedly. I will not usually pick up multiple Crucible extensions, but if I want a Space Prism, then in the same line I might also want a Crucible extension. Um, Not much to say about this card. It's pretty solid. It's a bit expensive. If you need the capacity, it's very worth picking it up. Oftentimes I like Space Prism more than Crucible Extension just because it's free to cast. So, but Crucible Extension can do the job if you don't get Space Prism or if you want multiple floor size increases. Next up, Grovel. Grovel is an interesting card in that it has two quite different effects. It's a 2-cost card that applies damage shield 1 to one unit, and then it adds 2 uncommon or rare morsel units to your hand. So it's generating some morsel and it can protect your unit. It's very nice if you need to protect a unit to be able to do so, and damage shield 1 will very often do the job. And if not, these 2 morsels you generate can be put in front of the unit you just gave damage shield to, maybe keep it alive a little bit longer. Maybe you get another damage shield morsel or lifesteal morsel to heal up that unit or protect it further. And 2 morsels for 2 Ember is not a terrible deal. If you add a damage shield into the mix, it becomes quite decent, but very often you want to cost reduce that card to make it a bit easier to play, especially if you're doing something like Ember Drain decks, then this card is actually a decent card to pick up. The 2 Ember cost can be mitigated by Perils of Production, or you can cost reduce it. It's very easy to make use of Grovel, and it's just a generally decent morsel generator. Maybe not quite as good as uh, Packed Morsels and Umbra Assault or Cannibalize, but it is very reliable, very easy to use, and it can help keep your units alive or even help with stacking damage shields. I think it's a pretty decent card, and I don't mind having a Grovel or 2 in most decks if I can afford to pay its Ember cost and still have the other parts of my deck work out as they should. Next up, Excavation Eruption. Excavation Eruption is a 4-cost card, basically the big brother of Mind Collapse, because it is also a damage spell and it also has Slay gain 2 energy. The big difference is not only in the cost, Excavation Eruption costs 4, but also in the way it does damage. This one deals damage to random enemy units, and it deals 20 damage 4 times. So, Excavation Eruption, usually you play it on the floor, usually you expect to kill the enemy backlines with it, but uh, sometimes it kills a front line instead, sometimes it kills not all the backlines, but usually it will kill some backlines. Like if there is a frontline unit with 2 backline units behind, then the chance that it kills a backline are very, very high. Basically, they're in the realm of 98% that you kill at least one backline with Excavation Eruption and get those 2 mana back from the Slay. I think Excavation Eruption is a deceptively powerful card. The 4 mana cost and the random targeting makes it seem pretty bad, but the fact that it it randomizes the target 4 times, means it's usually a very reliable way to kill backliners and very cheap because you get Ember back if you kill backliners. And sometimes you use it on a frontline unit that survived with maybe 40, 60 HP, and then Excavation Eruption will guaranteed kill that frontline unit. So for these reasons, I do like Excavation Eruption a lot. But oftentimes you will need a cost reduction on it or an additional Ember generation artifact to make good use of it. That is definitely a downside. But if you have these conditions met, then Excavation Eruption can do a, a lot. It can help you out quite a bit. It's another good way of killing backlines in Umbra, and that's worth quite a bit. The fact that you can also use it on a single isolated frontliner and often kill that unit as well, and in that case it becomes deal 80 to the front enemy unit, gain 2 Ember back. That's a very reasonable card. So don't underestimate Excavation Eruption just because it has the word random in it and a 4 in the Ember cost. It's still a pretty decent card. That said, it's decent, not totally amazing. Um, it can be good enough to cost reduce and hold over it, play it every turn, kill the enemy backlines, and then use the energy it provides to play other cards, especially if you have something like Split Anvil or any other card that helps with Ember management. Then Excavation Eruption can be quite solid, just because 20 damage 4 times, that's a lot of damage. That's a decent amount of damage. And yeah, so I will pick this card up from time to time if I have the opportunity to play it and want some more ways of dealing damage to backline units, or maybe burst down a barely surviving frontline unit. Excavation Eruption, definitely not a bad card. It's not it's not a, it's by far not the best card in Umbra either, but it is usable. It does the job, and it does it pretty well. Finally, the final uncommon spell in Umbra is Gem Trove. This is another 4-cost card. This one applies damage shield 1 to all friendly units on the floor, and then adds 3 uncommon rare or rare morsel units to your hand. So it's basically a beefed up grovel. Um, Oftentimes applying damage shield to your backline units doesn't matter as much, especially in Umbra where your backline units are very often morsels. Um, but there are cases where that can be valuable, and then Gem Trove is actually quite good. But other than that, 4 Ember for 3 morsels is just not a great deal, even if you get some damage shields out of it. It's a decent card if you have some way to circumvent its extremely high cost. Because unlike Excavation Eruption, this one won't give you any energy back after you play it. So Gem Trove is a bit hard to make work, but in some decks when you have some way that to make it free or generate a ridiculous amount of energy or something like that, then Gem Trove can actually be quite viable. The applying damage shield to all friendly units on the floor can be helpful in boss combat when you expect your front line to die eventually, and then the damage shields on the back line actually come into effect and might win you the boss combat, but that's very rarely the case, especially in Umbra, where the backline units usually are not the one dealing a lot of damage. So Gem Trove is a very niche card that you will only pick up in very specific circumstances, and in most deck you are better off with other morsel generations like Grovel or Antumbra Assault or something like that. Now let's have a look at the uncommon units. Um, I don't think there's a good way to filter out the morsels here, so let's just look at the units one by one. First up we have Crucible Collector. Crucible Collector is a 1 Ember 2 capacity unit, 2020 in stats, which is actually quite decent for a 1 Ember 2 capacity unit. Not amazing, not bad either. Its main power definitely comes from its Gorge ability, gain lifesteal 1. So whenever it eats any morsel, it gains 1 stack of lifesteal. Well, usually you only need 1 stack of lifesteal each turn. So what this card is aiming to do is definitely going for boss combats, gearing up during the during the normal waves, and then when the boss comes around, it has 10 stacks of lifesteal, and the boss will never be able to kill it because it will always heal back up to full. So that said, it is definitely a tank sort of unit because it does have the power to heal itself up over and over again, and that's very useful on a tank. But there are a few problems with that. One, it only has 20 health by base, so it definitely needs a Heartstone or at least a Battle Stone to increase its base HP a little before it can really make use of the lifesteal in the middle and later stages of the game. So after Daedalus, the 20 health is just not gonna cut it for a tank unit, because it will oftentimes get one shot even though it has a bunch of lifesteal. Some of the morsels can give it a bit of health, but that by itself is a bit too unreliable. So I would really advise, if you want to use a Crucible Collector, then give it plus 25 health with a Heartstone, or maybe plus 10 will be enough, at least for the mid game, with a Battlestone. There's another problem, and that is it's a frontline tank. What do you put behind it? Well, it needs to eat, so you put morsels behind it. But then on the other hand, these morsels don't provide much damage. There's only the magma morsels and the lifesteal morsels that actually have any attack stat at all. So maybe the Crucible Collector doesn't really have a lot to put behind it. If you have an extra capacity that might change, then you might put a 2 capacity unit of another clan behind it and have space for 2 morsels to feed it, and that can work out pretty well. It will not gain an amazing amount of lifesteal, but it will gain a decent amount that might be enough to get the boss kill, especially if some of these morsels you feed to the Crucible Collector actually grant lifesteal as well. Um, there is, however, one amazing unit to put behind the Crucible Collector that can deal the damage and benefit from Crucible Collector as a tank, while still not competing for the space with the morsels. And that is Architect Penumbra. If you have Architect Penumbra, Crucible Collector becomes a lot better because you can use Crucible Protector in front, Architect in the back, and still have room for a nice amount of morsels to feed the Crucible Collector. And that is one of the main upsides of Architect Penumbra. They make these Crucible units work a lot better. Other than that, Crucible Collector oftentimes not worth picking up just because Umbra has a variety of way to kill bosses. One of them is Gorge Penumbra, another one is Trample Penumbra, and finally most of the units Umbra has access to are actually very solid at killing bosses, just because of the scaling provided by morsels. By the time the boss comes around, your units will be much bigger than when you played them out. So very often Umbra is great at killing bosses, but has a bit more trouble in the earlier fights against the normal waves. And Crucible Collector is not gonna help you very much in the earlier waves because it has a hard time protecting something because of the space requirement of leaving room for morsels to eat, and because it only has 20 damage and is not a very good carrier for multi-strike because that will make its lifesteal stacks go away faster. Next up, we have another Crucible unit, and that's Crucible Warden. Crucible Warden has a slightly worse stat line. It only has 10 health, but instead of gaining lifesteal, it gains damage shield 1. Um, that might work out a little better if you don't give it any extra health, and it can use multi-strike a bit better. So it has a little bit more potential, but the problem then becomes that damage shield is a bit easier for bosses to deal with because there are a fair few bosses that have multi-strike, especially two you will always face, and that's Fel and Seraph. The final one would be Self-Made Harpy with 5 multi-strike, which is a big problem for Crucible Warden. Also, the normal waves will deplete your damage shield much quicker than they will deplete your lifesteal. So Crucible Warden requires a bit more food, so it needs more room as well. For all these reasons, Crucible Warden is very awkward to work with, but if you give it multi-strike, it can definitely work. It protects itself very well with the damage shields, and with multi-strike it will benefit from the attack buffs the morsels give out quite a bit, so it will actually become quite a valid damage dealer in that scenario. That said, there are other units that can use things like multi-strike just as well, or even come with multi-strike by base. So these are usually better choices just because there are quite a few morsels that are defensively good, but not that many that are offensively good. So you'd rather have an offensively good a good attacker unit basically by default, and you feed defensive morsels to them, than have a unit that has built-in defense and feeding offensive morsels to them. So for that reason, Crucible Warden is very often not a great card. It can also work with Architect Penumbra, but usually Crucible Collector, the lifesteal one, is a better choice to protect your Architect with. Just because the Crucible Warden requires a lot more morsel feeding to stay alive. And for all these reasons, I will very rarely pick a Crucible Warden in my Umbra deck. Next up, Amberforge. Amberforge is actually not a priority draw. You can't draw it as the guaranteed unit draw in a turn. You can also not find Amberforge in unit banners, where you would usually find all the Umbra unit. Amberforge is instead found in after non-boss combats, so fight 1, 2, 4, 5, and 7. The card rewards from those can have Amberforge in them. It can also be a starting card in your deck. Now Amberforge is very similar as a spell card we've seen before, and that is Engine Upgrade. Amberforge does a similar thing. It costs you 1 Amber and basically a floor worth of capacity, 4 capacity in fact, to generate Amber each turn. Amberforge will generate 2 Amber per turn. It does have 20 health, which is not a lot, but at least it won't die to a single enemy usually. So, yeah, you can even use it as a blocker for something like Wildwood Custodian or another Channeler, Totem, Mage from Stygian that provides a passive benefit just by being there, similar to Amberforge. I don't think Amber Forge is that great, but if you have a reliable killing floor, let's say on the second floor, then placing an Amber Forge on the top floor is relatively safe. Um, and it will just passively generate 2 amber each turn. 2 amber is a lot. It allows you to play out a lot more cards, and maybe you don't need to cost reduce as many cards, can use your gold for other things. So that can be helpful. But all in all, I don't think Amber Forge is that amazing, and usually I would rather have engine upgrade instead, which is a bit more reliable because it can be killed, even though it is a bit less powerful as well. After all, Amber Forge generates 2 Amber a turn and engine upgrade only 1. But oftentimes, 1 additional Amber per turn is gonna be enough. That said, if you do have a high Amber requirement and you think you can keep your Amber Forge safe well enough, then picking up an Amber Forge can help you power out more cards and get stronger in the long run. Um, all in all, I think Amber Forge is one of the weaker cards in Umbra, but it certainly has its place. Next up are 2 very similar cards, the Morsel Master and the Morsel Maker. Uh, just because their names are so similar, they can be confused easily. Let's start with the Morsel Master. The Morsel Master is a 1 capacity, 1 cost 10/10 unit that creates a copy of every morsel you play on this floor. This is very nice or if you don't have very high morsel generation, because it will double the amount of morsels and gorge triggers you get from your morsels. The only problem with it is that it takes up capacity, so it leaves a little bit less room for morsels to be played. But if there's an odd number of capacity points remaining on the floor, then usually playing morsels there will overstack the floor by 1 because Morsel Master will make a copy of the final morsel played in the last capacity point and overstack the floor with that. So oftentimes it doesn't reduce the maximum amount of morsels you can feed on a single turn, while providing you with morsel generation by duplicating these morsels. Morsel Master is especially valuable if you have powerful morsels but in lower numbers, with something like a making of a morsel which guarantees you a morsel miner. And duplicating a morsel miner is obviously a lot of value, so that can be very powerful. And if you have multiple floors you want to use morsels in, you can have a morsel master on one of them to reduce the amount of morsels you have to put on that floor for a good effect, and have more morsels to spare for your other floor. And finally, the morsel master itself provides 10 damage on a 1 capacity unit, which isn't bad. And if you have a big gorge unit like an Overgorger or a Penumbra in front of your Morsel Master, the big unit can kill the enemy frontline, and Morsel Master has easy access to the enemy backline. Maybe he can even bring a pair of Magma Morsels, so you can kill even wide backlines with that. And that can certainly be helpful. So Morsel Master, pretty solid. Uh, it is most often used when you don't get enough morsel generation to make maximum use of your capacity. Then Morsel Master can jump in and help you double all the morsels you play on a single floor. In my opinion, a pretty solid unit, uh, often worth it if you have multiple floors. One problem with Morsel Master is that it is a guaranteed priority draw. So oftentimes you want to have the Gorgers out early, so you can start feeding them as soon as possible, but Muscle Master might delay that for a turn, because you might draw into Muscle Master first, and that can be a bit awkward, but usually he accelerates the morsel feeding process afterwards, so that your gorge unit will be able to catch up thanks to the morsel master. Next, morsel master's brother, the morsel maker. He's a 2-cost unit, and he actually doesn't have any damage capabilities by himself. What he does have is a resolve trigger to summon an Umbra morsel and a magma morsel in his room. These will spawn in front of the morsel maker, in fact directly in front of the morsel maker. So if the morsel maker is on his own, then they will serve as blockers for the morsel maker and protect him from harm. That on itself isn't very useful because the morsel maker doesn't have any power by default. The main value of Morsel Maker is just to provide a constant stream of morsels, not high quality morsels. The Antumbra morsel is only +3 health, the Magma morsel is only +3 attack. So basically he provides the value of a steel enhancer each turn. That is not bad, but also not very good. The main use of Morsel Maker is if you need a steady flow of morsels for something to trigger every turn with the Gorge triggers, then Morsel Maker can provide you that. So you are free to use your higher quality morsels on other floors and just have these medium quality morsels every turn. I think Morsel Master is a little bit better than Morsel Maker, but both fill a similar role in that they provide you with more morsel generation. Morsel Maker itself doesn't have any attack capabilities, but the Magma Morsel it spawns does, so it will at least provide 3 damage a turn to kill some backliners. Keep in mind that Morsel Maker after the first turn will summon these morsels at the end of turn after the morsels have been eaten, so they will take up capacity. So if you play Morsel Maker on a floor, that might block you from playing other units on that floor later, because he will take up 3 capacity afterwards with the morsels he provides. If there are no other units, he will eat the morsels himself and just grow by +3/+3 every turn, which I think is a bit too slow to use him that way. So better use him to provide morsels for someone else. One thing to note on Covenant 10 and higher, I advise you not to play Morsel Maker on the top floor, because he will be dazed on his first turn, so he won't summon any morsels on his first turn, because resolves don't trigger on dazed enemies. Then on the second turn, he will only summon morsels at the end of turn, and these morsels will only be eaten at the end of the third turn. And that's, in my opinion, a bit too slow to really use him. So he becomes quite a bit worse on Covenant 10 and above, just because that daze effect really slows the Morsel Maker down. On the upside, if you play him on the top floor, the Magma Morsel he spawns will not be dazed, because it's spawned by another unit, and only units you play will be dazed. So the Magma Morsel at least can attack every turn, instead of being dazed every turn. But still, I think Morsel Maker it can help out with providing a steady stream of morsels to eat, but it's a little bit weaker than the Morsel Master, also because of its expensive 2 Amber cost. Next up, Alloyed Construct. Alloy Construct is a 2-cost, 2-capacity Gorge unit, 25/25 stat line. It comes with multi-strike 1 by base, so that already seems powerful. Let's look at its Gorge. Its Gorge gain is Gain Fuel 1. Now, what is Fuel 1? Well, it also has Inert. So basically, it is inactive when you play it. It gains fuel when it eats morsels, and every turn it loses one stack of fuel, and when it doesn't have while it has fuel, it is active, it can attack, and when it doesn't have fuel, it will not attack anymore. So the gorge effect here is basically a downside, or rather negates a downside the unit comes with. So for alloy construct to be useful, you need to feed it every turn, and it has a drawback of not being able to attack the turn you play it unless you have something like a feast to feed it immediately before combat begins. So oftentimes you don't want to set it up right on the bottom floor, so it has time to get some fuel first. That said, having multi-strike on that unit makes it very powerful because it scales very well with any attack buffs the morsels might grant. It scales very well with upgrades from the unit shop, and with 25 health it usually is tanky enough that it doesn't need immediate health upgrades and can just work by itself. Note that alloyed construct, because it needs to gorge to do something, needs to be your frontliner, and you can't have anything in front of it to protect it. So it can be a bit vulnerable, but because many morsels have defensive ability and it will be eating morsels anyways, a lot of the time that's not an issue. Alloy Construct is one of the strongest Gorge units in Umbra just because it comes with a multi-strike, and to be honest, if you have a unit with multi-strike in Umbra, you want to feed it morsels anyway because it scales very well with these morsels buffs. So Alloy Construct, very powerful unit, often worth picking up if you are looking for a way to kill big frontline units. Alloy Construct provides a lot of upfront damage with the multi-strike, with the multi-strike scaling well with the Morsel's attack buffs. So I can recommend picking up Alloy Construct. It does have a few downsides. It's it has to be a frontline. It only has 25 health, and you really want offensive buffs from the uh, Merchant of Steel because they scale so well with multi-strike, or even give it more multi-strike. Why not? They can work out very well as well to make these morsel buffs scale even better. So you are really reliant on morsel buffs to keep this thing alive. Things like Grovel or Immortal Trade or Void Binding can help a lot with that. And you can even use morsels in front of it to block some hits for it sometimes. So all in all, I think Alloy Construct, one of the more powerful cards in this clan, and very much recommended to use it as one of your Gorge units. It can be a very strong floor by its own, just with the morsels behind it, powering it. Finally, there is Shadow Eater. Shadow Eater is a 3 capacity, 2 cost, 050 unit. That's quite tanky already, but it becomes even more tanky when we consider its Gorge abilities. That's restore 5 health, deal 5 damage to enemy units. So whenever it eats a morsel, it heals itself by 5 health and then deals 5 damage to the entire enemy floor. Shadow Eater is one of the best units in Umbra to clear off backline constantly, which can be very nice. Set up a Shadow Eater on the bottom floor to clear out those pesky backliners dealing a bunch of damage. Shadow Eater can take that. He has 50 health, he heals whenever he eats a morsel, and some of these morsels will make it more tanky, by granting it health or damage shield, and if it gets a bunch of attack from the morsels, it can even heal a bit with lifesteal as well, if you feed it lifesteal morsels. But all in all, Shadow Eater doesn't really require quality morsels to function. Just feed it 1 or 2 morsels every turn and it will perform quite nicely until very high damage units come in. Then it might need a little bit of help. Because it is quite tanky and provides a steady source of AoE damage as long as you have morsels to feed it to, um, then Shadow, yeah, because Shadow Eater is that tanky and is that consistent and deals very well with backline units, I rate it quite highly and very often pick up Shadow Eater as my secondary Gorge unit. As I said, I play Umbra a lot on 2 lanes just because that is a good number to make good use of many of the morsel generation cards. Very often you will generate 4 to 6 morsels a turn, or maybe 3 to 6 morsels a turn, and that means you will have enough to feed about 2 floors worth of units. And Shadow Eater very often is one of these units, just to clear out the backline, and then maybe a Gorge Penumbra or a Alloyed Construct can take out these tanky frontline units that survive the Shadow Eater. I think Shadow Eater is quite powerful, but you will need a steady generation of morsels. Maybe something like a morsel maker can work very well with the Shadow Eater. Morsel Master less so, because you don't really care about the quality of morsels you feed and you really want Morsel Master to dupe your best morsels, so maybe better put Morsel Master on your other Gorge floor and feed the bad morsels to Shadow Eater and the strong morsels with Morsel Master to your other unit. But all in all, Shadow Eater, a very solid card, a very good way of taking care of backline units. If you don't have a holdover on Tumbra Assault or something like that, then Shadow Eater can deal with the waves backline units for you. Finally, let's look at the rare cards. Let's start with the units while we are at talking about units. After all, there's Shadow Eater's twin, the Overgorger. Let's talk about that one. Overgorger is a 2 cost, 3 capacity, 0 15, somewhat similar to Shadow Eater but a lot less fragile. Its main power comes from its Gorge ability, plus gain +2 attack permanently. Permanently means not only this combat, but all future combats as well. So if you see as an early Overgorger, it can be a good it can be great to pick it up, start feeding it, so its attack can grow, and then later on it can easily get to 200, 300 or even more attack thanks to its ability. Overgorger can be a good way to get flying boss kills in Umbra, just because it can get such high attack values. One problem with Overgorger is that it's a bit of a liability early on, because it starts out with 0 attack, it needs to eat some morsels first before it can do anything. It only has 15 health, it does cost 2 Ember to play out. So it's a bit hard to get it started, and it will always need some sort of protection. Well, one of the best protection you can give it is quick, because it will have enough attack eventually to kill anything it faces, especially if you can put trample on it as well. Quick will protect it very well. Instead of trample, multi-strike works very well on Overgorger as well. If you pick up an Overgorger, it's very recommended to upgrade it as a priority, because it will be your main carrying unit once it's fed enough. But keep in mind that it can sometimes be hard to carry an Overgorger through the first 1 or 2 combats because it starts off very weak. But because it scales so well, picking up an early Overgorger and devoting these resources into it can pay off pretty soon. After 2-3 combats, Overgorger will be a pretty major force already, and once it has like 200 attack, you might even want to stop feeding it at all and just put it behind something that's a little more tanky to protect it, so you don't need to worry about its health. Or maybe you upgrade its health and just use it on its own. Get some healing from lifesteal morsels and things like that. There are many ways to make a fat Overgorger work. So all in all, Overgorger, a very good pickup early on. It becomes much less powerful if you pick it up after Fell, because it has much less time to grow, and having a unit that is not providing any power in the combats after Fell can be a bit of an issue, because these combats can be quite tough. So I don't recommend picking up an Overgorger after Fell, which is the latest you can see it. But after Daedalus, it's definitely a great pickup, and maybe even pick it up in the 4th ring if you find it there. So, Overgorger, a nice, powerful carry unit that can grow ridiculously but requires a lot of investment early. Definitely a fun build around card. And definitely powerful. Shadow Siege is the next card. This is also a build around card. It's a 200, 150 stat line unit, just a big stat stick. It requires 5 capacity on the floor you want to play it on, and it requires 6 amber to pay. So how do we make this work? Well, there are a few ways to play out the Shadow Siege. Less reliable are some spells in Umbra that generate Ember. You need to have these in the same hand as the Shadow Siege to play it. And because Shadow Siege is a priority draw, there's a big chance it will be in your first hand. So that's a bit of an issue. But there are a few other ways. There is Channel Song from the Awoken clan that makes a unit stronger and free to play. That could work well with the Shadow Siege if you can manage to guarantee Channel Song hitting the Shadow Siege. There are a few artifacts that work well with it. Forever Flame reduces its cost to 4, so you can play it with just a single boss relic for energy. Improved Firebox gives you 7 energy on the first turn of battle, and because Shadow Siege is a priority unit, that will work out with it quite often. Hell Spanners can work as well, but it's a bit harder to make it work because you need to play 2 units first. Maybe there can be your Penumbra and a Morsel, and then you play Shadow Siege with the 6 Ember you have. Maybe. That requires some amount of Ember upgrade from bosses though. Of course, Volatile Gauge randomizes its cost from 0 to 3, so it will always be playable, and Sketches of Salvation can pull it out at the start of the battle. Shadow Siege is very strong with Sketches of Salvation. And Unbroken Horn can also work for it if you are playing Hellhound. In case you're not drawing it in your first hand, you might save the energy from the first turn to play Shadow Siege on the second turn. And then there's Flicker Slicker if you are playing Remnant. Whenever you play a unit, a random card in your hand is reduced to 0 cost for the turn. That means if you play all your other cards first, then play your champion or any unit, then Shadow Siege will be reduced to 0 cost and will be free to play. So If you have any of these ways to make Shadow Siege work, then that's great, and it will win fights for you all on its own. Basically, for the first few fights and even Daedalus, if you play a Shadow Siege, you win the combat. There's no way the boss gets past this Shadow Siege. Shadow Siege will demolish any front lines, and you might need some cleanup with backlines after it, but it will definitely kill front lines and it will definitely kill the boss. If you give it ulti strike, it will also help with backlines. It can kill two front lines in the same turn. Basically, if you have Shadow Siege and you can play it, you will usually win the fight. The tough part is getting to play it reliably, and if you can't, it can be quite the liability because it is a priority draw. It will mess with your other unit draw sometimes, and after that it's just in your deck and you need to find it at the right time. That can be a bit awkward, but if you have a way to make it work, Shadow Siege is totally game breaking. I had a few runs where I had a Shadow Siege early and something like Sketches of Salvation or Volatile Gorge, and then it was just an auto win because Shadow Siege is so powerful. Just dupe it whenever you can if you have Sketches of Salvation or Volatile Gorge, and that will generally win the run for you. If you don't have a way to reliably play it, it can be picked up speculatively, but I would really advise against that because oftentimes it will be a major downside to play not only with a card you can play, that's not that bad, but with a unit that takes up a priority draw you can't play. That can be really bad, because that might delay your other units setup. Especially bad if these are gorgers and you need to feed them first. Now, finally, let's look at the rare spells Umbra has. There are quite a few X-cost spells in here. Let's start with the first one, Forever Consumed. Forever Consumed costs X, deals 30 times X damage to the front enemy unit. Now, that's a pretty good X-cost spell. 30 times X damage is quite a lot, actually. Um, Of course, this is immensely powerful if you have the first Hell Pact, dealing 90 for 0 or 120 for 1, or even more than that if you need it, is of course very powerful. But Forever Consumed can be useful even if you don't have anything like that. Just a little bit of energy generation, so you can easily play for like 2 or 3 or whatever you need it to kill one unit. Yeah, it's just a good frontline damage spell that's very flexible and is basically efficient at every cost you play it. If you compare it to some of the Stygian damage spells, there's Titan's Gratitude, a 1 cost that deals 25. There's Helical Crystallis, a 2 cost that deals 50, and there's Ice Tornado, a 3 cost that deals 60. Forever Consumed outscales all of these. Um, so it's just a very general, decent frontline damage spell. So not much to say about that. If you need a frontline damage spell, if you have a bunch of energy generation, then Forever Consumed is a great card. There are, however, X-cost spells in Umbra specifically. Well, there is one X-cost spell in Umbra specifically that is even more powerful than that. But first, let's look at Kindle. Kindle is an X-cost card that consumes and gains 2x energy. So it doubles your energy basically. You consume this card and then and then after that you have double the energy you had before. So when is that useful? That's a good question. Not very often, to be honest. You need to have Kindle in the right hand. Maybe you can give it permafrost to make that a bit easier. If you have permafrost with it, it might be able to play out a Shadow Siege or something like that, or fuel a giant X cost like Forever Consumed or Shroud Spike. We will look at that in just a moment. But other than that, I think Kindle is not that great. You can't rely on it as your energy source because it consumes after playing it once, so holdover is not really an option unless you consume remove it as well, and then it will return less energy. So if you consume remove and hold over it, then it will generate 2x minus 1 energy, which with 3 energy is only a payout of 4, so you will only gain 1 energy a turn. If you have 4 energy by base, it's a bit better. It will pay out 6 energy in that scenario and will give you 2 energy a turn, which might actually be worth the card draw for it you spend on the holdover every turn. But basically, Kindle's main purpose is to fuel big X cost spells, and Forever Consumed can be one that benefit a lot from Kindle, and then the next would be Shroud Spike. Other than that, Kindle, not a great card. It's very hard to make use of that energy doubling if you just draw it randomly in a hand. You might not even have that much to cast that you can make use of all that amber. Shroud Spike, on the other hand. Shroud Spike is an X-cost card with Consume that kills a morsel unit and then triggers Eaten and Gorge abilities as if that morsel had been eaten 2x times. So basically what that means is if you play this for let's say 3 amber on a morsel miner, that means the morsel miner's eaten ability will be triggered 6 times, and the gorge ability of the unit that would eat the morsel miner will be triggered 6 times as well. Let's say um, a Crucible Collector. So the Crucible Collector will get plus 30 from that Morsel Miner, and it will trigger its Gorge ability 6 times, so it will gain 6 lifesteal as well. And that's a very powerful effect. A single Shroud Spike can be easily worth a bunch of morsels on one turn, on one floor. You don't need to uh, don't need to pay attention to capacity, and you don't need to pay attention to spikes or sweep on the enemy side of the board. You can get a really large power boost very early on with a Shroud Spike. You can quick start your Gorge Penumbra with the Shroud Spike. Shroud Spike is just very powerful. Very often you only need to resolve one single Shroud Spike in the game for 3 or 4 amber, and that will oftentimes make your Gorge unit as powerful as it needs to be. Especially if you're playing Gorge Penumbra, who gains a lot of stats out of these Gorge triggers, then the Shroud Spike can be very powerful. If I'm using Gorge units at all, then Shroud Spike is very high on my pick list. I will almost always pick up one Shroud Spike if I have the chance, and maybe even pick up a second, just so I have a better chance to get one early. And then if I get the later one, it is still useful. I might not need the power immediately, but maybe I need some damage shields, maybe I need some life steals. Shroud Spike can give me that. Um, a bit of an issue can be that you need to have morsels first, so if you use something like Shade Splitter to generate the morsel and then Shroud Spike, you might not get that high of a casting cost for it, so it will not be that impactful, but even eating a strong morsel 4 times is already a pretty significant effect with a good Gorge unit. So Shroud Spike, definitely one of the most powerful cards in Umbra, and definitely one of the most powerful X-cost spells in the game as well. Next up, Wretch. Wretch is a interesting card. It's a zero cost card that returns consumed morsel units to your hand. Now, what this means is not that it returns every morsel that has ever been eaten on this floor or something. It just looks at your consume pile, finds every morsel card in your consume pile, and puts them into your hand. And if there are more in the consume pile than the capacity of your hand, the other morsels go into your discard pile instead. Um, Wretch is a lot of morsel generation on a single card for 0 mana, so that's quite powerful. You can't use it as your first morsel generation card, of course, because first you need to get these morsels into the consume pile before you can actually use Wretch. But after that, Wretch will provide you with a large amount of morsels when you play it. Very often too many morsels to play them out all, so you might have to throw some of them back into your deck. Which is a little bit of a downside to Wretch. If you have too many morsels in your consume pile, you will flood your deck with morsels. That's a bit of an issue because drawing a single morsel is oftentimes less powerful than drawing a more impactful card that generates morsels and maybe has some other effect as well. So for that reason, Wretch needs to be used carefully. If you are, however, looking for an insane amount of morsel generation, Wretch can provide that for you, especially if you use things like Space Prism or something to increase capacity over time. Then the capability of Wretch to provide more and more morsels as the game goes on is very helpful. Yeah, if you need a bunch more morsel generation on top of the ones you already have, then Wretch is a very nice card. Zero cost, so easy to play. Just make sure you don't flood your deck with morsels after playing Wretch. Next up, Shroud Mitosis. Shroud Mitosis is a 1-cost card that creates 3 copies of a morsel unit. It's kinda similar to Cannibalize in that you need to have a target for it. Oftentimes the target of Cannibalize will be a morsel unit as well, and that it creates 3 morsels out of that. The difference is, with Shroud Mitosis, there are actually 4 morsels after that. With Cannibalize, the morsel you targeted will die. So Shroud Mitosis immediately provides a bit more power than Cannibalize. It's also more flexible to use in that the 3 copies of said morsel can spawn even if your capacity is already full, as long as the unit limit isn't reached. So finally, you can use the Shroud Mitosis targeted on a morsel of your choice. You can use it on a morsel miner and you will get guaranteed 3 more morsel miners. You can use it on lifesteal or damage shield. Each of these are very valuable, and if you have none of these, the health or attack morsels might be okay targets as well. I think Shroud Mitosis is one of the better cards to increase the amount of morsels your units can eat, just because it doesn't care about capacity and it can target your best morsels. And it immediately generates 3 morsels, which is a lot for a 1-cost card. All these benefits make me pick Shroud Mitosis very highly, but you need to be careful if you don't have a morsel to play Shroud Mitosis on. It's a dead card, so that's a bit of an issue. Still, Shroud Mitosis, very powerful card, uh, especially to use on a floor with a large Gorge unit, one that's 3 capacity, especially because it doesn't have a lot of room to put morsels behind, then you just fill up the morsel slots you have, and then after that your Shroud Mitosis your best morsels, and then you still have 5, maybe even 6 morsels to feed to that unit. So Shroud Mitosis very powerful, and getting holdover on it can be quite good if you have a consistent morsel generation engine, just a bunch of good morsel generation cards, or maybe one of the morsel generation artifacts we will look at very soon. And for all these reasons, I rate Shroud Mitosis on a similar scale as Shroud Spike because it does something very similar. Shroud Spike needs a morsel, as does Shroud Mitosis. Shroud Spike ignores capacity because it only needs that one morsel, so does Shroud Mitosis. Shroud Spike can target your best morsel, so can Shroud Mitosis. And Shroud Mitosis is basically a Shroud Spike for 2, played for 2 energy, because it allows you to eat that one morsel 4 times. Shroud Spike does it immediately and can scale better with energy, so on average it's a bit better, but it does have consume, while Shroud Mitosis doesn't, and you can hold over Shroud Mitosis. So definitely has some upsides to it. And similar to Shroud Spike, I think Shroud Mitosis is one of the best cards in a Gorge heavy Umbra deck. Yeah. Next up, Furnace Tap. Furnace Tap is one of the insanely powerful Ember Drain spells, which it's a 2-cost spell. It has Consume, unlike other Ember Drain cards. It applies Rage 4 to a unit. It applies Multi-Strike 1, and then it applies Ember Drain 4. So Multi-Strike 1, that's like a one-horned tome. And it adds 4 Rage on top to give that Multi-Strike a little bit more punching power. So it's an extremely powerful buff, especially on the large units Umbra can have, like an Overgorge or Trample or Gorge Penumbra. Even Architect Penumbra can pack quite a punch after a Furnace tap. Or anything else that consumed a bunch of magma morsels, for example. You can even use it on a morsel, even though that's oftentimes kind of a waste, but maybe you need that extra damage to kill some backliners that wouldn't die otherwise. But with consume and 2 cost, unlike the other Ember Drain cards, which are 0 cost and their cost is mostly in the Ember Drain, this card has an actual Ember cost associated with it. And that makes it a bit more difficult to play in an Ember Drain deck, because oftentimes you won't have the Ember to play it. So there are 2 ways around that. Either you cost reduce it twice, or you play Perils of Production, possibly with holdover, or something like Ember Cache. Um, any of these make Furnace Tap very castable, and because it is so extremely powerful, and the primary drawback of it is the fact that it applies Ember Drain 4, which will often shut you down for 1 turn, almost certainly, oftentimes 2 or even 3 turns. That's rough. So if you are playing a full Ember Drain deck and have a way to play the Furnace Tap, you pick it. Even if you're not playing an Ember Drain deck, you can pick a Furnace Tap, you can give it Permafrost maybe, and just play it on the turn the boss comes up, or if you absolutely need to save the situation before that, maybe you can play it before then, and it gives you an insane amount of power. What I would not recommend usually is, as it is depicted here in the picture, playing it on a morsel. That is often a bit of a waste of the potential of Furnace Tap. If you play with Furnace Tap in a non-Ember Drain heavy deck, just as a good card to give you some additional punching power against bosses, for example, be very careful when you decide to play it, be certain that you can deal with the next 1 or 2 turns without playing any cards that cost Ember, which sometimes can be hard. But if your setup is good and everything is going great, you just need that extra punch, then Furnace Tap can give you that. All in all, a card with very high potential that can be hard to use, but definitely one of the strongest cards, one of the highest potential cards in all of Umbra and all of the game even. Next up is Umbra Stone. This card is much simpler. It's also a very powerful buff. It costs 2 Ember, consumes and applies Trample to a unit. Umbra can have quite large units, especially Gorge Penumbra, things like Alloyed Construct, Shadow Siege, Overgorger, all of these benefit a lot from having Trample because suddenly they can deal with whole floors by themselves. They don't need magma morsels behind them or morsel masters clearing the backline. They don't need a shadow eater below them clearing the backline for them. They can do all of that themselves with the Umbra Stone. Umbra Stone is the only way to gain trample for most units because there is no shop upgrade that provides trample, so Umbra Stone can be a very valuable pickup if you run a floor with a single large unit. Then Umbra Stone can make that unit suddenly kill entire floors themselves. Last but not least, there is Blazing Bolts. Blazing Bolts might be one of the most complicated cards in the game. It's a 3-cost spell that purges. So after you play it, it is removed from your deck entirely. But it deals 30 damage to the front enemy unit and adds a stronger version of itself to your discard pile. The stronger version is another 3-cost spell that deals 30 damage to a random enemy unit 2 times. This time it's not front enemy unit, it's random enemy unit, so it can kill backlines. Um, it does it 2 times, so it's 60 damage in total, maybe split over 2 units, maybe on the same, depending how the randomness goes. And again, it purges and adds a stronger version of this card to your discard pile. Now, the third one is the final form. The third Blazing Bolt no longer purges and no longer adds stronger versions of itself. The third Blazing Bolts is simply a 3-cost spell that deals 30 damage to a random enemy unit 4 times. And that's pretty good for 3 Ember. It's another way of dealing with backlines as well as having the capability of killing front lines as well if they are isolated, or just weakening them so your units can kill them more easily. Um, that said, Blazing Bolts is a lot of work to put into a single card because the first and the second one are kind of weak and only the third one is actually decent. Keep in mind, if you upgrade Blazing Bolts, these upgrades will actually carry over to the stronger versions. So if you cost reduce the first Blazing Bolts, that cost reduction won't be lost. You will still have the cost reduction on the second and the final version of Blazing Bolts. So it can be a good idea to cost reduce Blazing Bolts early so you can play and upgrade it a little easier and finally have the final version also reduced, so it is a bit easier to use. All in all, I think Blazing Bolts can be a good card if you need something like that. Excavation Eruption is often a better way of achieving the same goal, but Blazing Bolts does a bit more damage and does come with a slightly lower Ember cost, with the downside that you have to find the time to play the first 2 versions first. These upgrades of Blazing Bolts are permanent, by the way. You only need to play the first version in a single combat and the second version in a single combat, and then you will have the final version for all the combats to come, because these don't consume, these purge. And the stronger versions are actually permanent. One thing to note, if you are planning to use holdover on a Blazing Bolts, you need to get the final upgrade first, because you can not put holdover on a card that has purge. So you need to reach the final upgrade stage first before you can put holdover on this card, which can sometimes be useful. Cost reduce it, put holdover on it, and it will clear off most of the enemy waves for you. You just need to find a good way to deal with bosses. Something like a Gorge Penumbra can make good use of a strategy like this if you can find cheap muscle generation that you can play alongside your Blazing Bolt to keep your Penumbra fed. So that's it for the Umbra cards. I think we covered them all. So let's look at the Umbra artifacts next. Umbra has a bunch of artifacts that care about morsels. Actually, most of the artifacts have something to do with morsels, so these are most useful if you are in a Gorge build and might lose some value otherwise. First off, Abandoned Antumbra. At the start of turn, add a common or uncommon morsel unit to hand. This is quite nice because it is very consistent. It will always guarantee you have at least one morsel each turn, which is very good for some cards like Shroud Spike, Shadow Eater, Shroud Mitosis. All these cards benefit a lot from having guaranteed morsel generation. Cannibalize as well. Uh, so while these morsels are oftentimes not that powerful because they can be commons, they can't be the rare morsel miner. The just the consistency of the Abandoned Antumbra can make it a valuable pickup if you are using a morsel-based strategy, Gorge mostly. Next up, Chain of Gems. Apply damage heal 2 to the first friendly unit summoned each turn. That enables you. That is pretty useful early on for the setup. It guarantees your units will survive for a bit and you have time to feed them some morsels. Later on, in later turns, if you have your main unit set up, you can use Chain of Gems to play morsels in front of your units to tank some damage for them. If your first friendly unit summoned is a morsel, then it will get the damage shield 2 from the Chain of Gems. So that's quite nice. It can provide a lot of protection for your units on setup first and later on with morsel blocks. Just keep in mind, if you have Chain of Gems, you might want to pay attention to the order your units are set up. I often mess it up and play a morsel first and get the 2 damage shield on it and then eat it and waste the Chain of Gems trigger. But if you have it and pay close attention to it, it can provide so much protection to your entire team that I think it's one of the best relics for Umbra, definitely. Next up, Commemorative Spike. At the start of battle, summon a morsel miner on each floor. That is a nice way to quick start your entire setup, because every floor will already have a powerful morsel ready to be eaten and trigger Gorge abilities. It's just very nice for setup. A few things to note about this relic. Once, these morsel miners are cardless. They won't go to the consume pile. You can't use this with Melting Remnant to reform morsel miners right from the get-go, and you can't use Reg to bring these back. Just something to keep in mind. Another thing is if you are running Trample Penumbra, the monstrous one that increases in capacity use, then Commemorative Spike can screw you over. If you only have 6 capacity on your floor and you need those 6 capacity to play Penumbra, and you have Commemorative Spike, then there will be a Morsel Miner on every floor, and no floor will have the 6 capacity required to play Penumbra. So avoid this artifact if you are running Monstrous Penumbra and have exactly enough capacity to play it. You need to have at least one capacity more so the Morsel Miner doesn't block your Monstrous Penumbra. Just something to keep in mind because I have made this mistake before of picking this artifact and then realizing, oh, I can't play my champion. Guess I lose. Next up, Fossilized Fangs. Gorge abilities trigger an additional time. This is a powerful relic. Some Gorge abilities are very strong. Those that generate damage, shield, and lifesteal benefit a lot from Fossilized Fangs. Maybe suddenly they can work as frontline tanks because a single morsel slot can provide them with 2 damage shields or 2 stacks of lifesteal each turn. And you can actually put another unit behind them. So Fossilized Fangs can be good for those. But even better for things like Shadow Eater, who suddenly heals himself twice as much and deals twice as much damage to the entire enemy floor. Overgorger, who grows twice as fast. Or the Gorge Penumbra, the Glutton, who gains plus 24 attack for every morsel it eats with the Fossilized Fangs on the final stage. Definitely a huge power boost for Gorge units, and one and if I see this artifact very early on in my Umbra run, I will almost certainly pick it up and try to build into it, because it's just an amazing power spike for all these Gorge units. Next, there's Mask of Penumbra. Whenever you summon your first morsel unit each turn, draw 1. Not much to be said about this. It's free card draw, which is always nice. Usually you will have a morsel each turn, uh, but there are some turns where you might not have a morsel, so it's probably not gonna trigger 100% of the turns unless you have something like Abandoned Umbra, but it will have a very high trigger rate. In most Umbra decks you can reliably trigger this, like 80 to 90% of your turns easily, and just draw an additional card on each turn, which is powerful. And I will very often pick up a Mask of Penumbra, but is not as run defining as something like Fossilized Fangs, which provides a lot of direction for your run to go. Mask of Penumbra is more just a general power boost, and for that reason also a very nice pickup early, because you are still very flexible with this artifact. Next up, Mind Checks. +2 capacity on the middle floor. That is very nice, especially because this capacity is always available. You don't need to wait until you draw a specific card, like with Space Prism or Crucible Extension. Mind Checks is just always active. It can be your way of playing Gorge Penumbra. So Mind Check's definitely a very strong relic. One I would probably pick up very often, no matter what build I'm playing. Almost every build can make use of a middle floor that's increased in capacity. Umbra can use it for more feeding. Maybe you can even do some morsel feeding on the middle floor and still have a backline unit dealing some damage or something like that. Mind Check's just generally very powerful. even it can even provide you with a way to play your trample penumbra without having to pick up capacity artifacts if you rather have energy or draw. If you have mind checks, you don't need the capacity artifacts to play your monstrous 3 penumbra with 6 capacity. You are just limited to playing him on the middle floor, but that's okay. You even have room for one morsel or something like that on that floor that way. Next up, Refined Void. Friendly units enter with lifesteal 2. This is a bit less powerful than the Chain of Gems in my opinion, just because it only has effects early on. The lifesteal will make it easier for you to set up. The units will uh, keep themselves alive for 2 turns at the very least, unless they get one shot from the enemy wave. So Refined Void, nice. But after these 2 turns and after the lifesteal is gone, you still have to keep these units alive yourself. So it's not that big of an effect. It's mostly a nice to have, and I think Umbra has some trouble with the fact that it has setup times on almost all of the units because of how the morsel and gorge effects work. Uh, so Refined Void can certainly help, but in my opinion, the effect is not big enough that I would consider it a top tier artifact. It's more of a nice to have in my eyes. It can be a bit better if you stack up lifesteal on a unit, because then these 2 lifesteal might actually mean that you can carry more lifesteal to the end game, which is nice, but still not game breaking or anything. Next up, Shade Lamp. The first time each turn an enemy unit dies, add 2 morsel units to hand. So this is a very nice effect. This is totally random morsel units. It can give you morsel miners. It can also give you rubble morsels, I think. I'm not quite sure about the rubble morsel, but I am certain that it can give you morsel miners. And of course it can give you all the uncommon morsels as well. So Shade Lamp, a lot of morsel generation, but you need to kill an enemy for it to trigger. You can do that with spells during your turn and play these morsels right away, or you can just wait for combat to resolve, kill enemies in combat, get these morsels, but only be able to play it on the turn after. Um, Keep in mind that even while you are only able to play these units the turn after, it still counts as the current turn if you kill the unit in combat, and next turn the Shade Lamp is free to trigger again. So if you kill a unit in combat, get these 2 morsels, and the next turn you kill a unit with a spell, you might get 4 morsels out of a single turn, of 4 morsels to play in a single turn with the Shade Lamp. So it's not uh, it's not every turn you get 2 morsels, but sometimes it can be you get 2 morsels on the next turn. Sometimes it can be get 2 morsels this turn. So that's 2 random morsels. That's actually quite powerful. That's basically the equivalent of a grovel without the damage shield it provides. So this is a very powerful effect. It requires you to kill an enemy unit, but oftentimes you will kill an enemy unit on most turns. So in general, Shade Lamp will have a higher total morsel output than something like an Abandoned Umbra, but it is a bit less reliable. But definitely a strong artifact, which if I find it will push me into picking up more capacity and maybe more gorge units, because I will have the ability to generate more morsels and feed them more often. Next up, Teeth of Gold. Teeth of Gold is probably one of the weakest artifacts in Umbra, which says a lot about the quality of Umbra artifacts because Teeth of Gold is pretty good as well. Teeth of Gold deals 2 damage to the rear enemy unit when a morsel unit is eaten. Now this is very nice because oftentimes you will have single big units that are capable of killing the frontline enemy, but will not do so well against enemy backlines. So for that reason, Teeth of Gold can help you out a lot by killing the enemy backlines for you by eating morsels. The damage is not very significant otherwise, so if you already have a good way of killing backlines, Teeth of Gold might not be that great, because if you eat, let's say, 3 morsels, then 6 damage will not make a big difference on a frontline unit. But still, it provides a nice, even though not completely reliable way of dealing with backlines. The only problem with it is that it triggers after combats most of the times, unless you have something like a feast or a shroud spike. So you still need to survive the damage from the enemy backline for a turn before the Teeth of Gold actually triggers. One thing to note with Shroud Spike, it does trigger for every Shroud Spike activation. So if you play a Shroud Spike for 3 and trigger Eaten and Gorge 6 times with it, then you will also trigger Teeth of Gold 6 times with it, which is nice. And next, finally, the last Umbra relic is Winged Technology. Morsel units get damage shield 1. That is very helpful to prevent morsels from dying to sweep, to spikes, and if there's only one enemy unit, you can play your morsel in front, prevent some damage to your gorge unit instead. Um, the morsel will still survive thanks to the damage shield. And if you need to put multiple morsels in front of a unit to protect it from dying to the enemies, then Wing Technology will actually double the effectiveness of blocking with your morsel units. So that's very nice as well. So Wing Technology always nice to have, just because sweep and spikes can be really nasty for Umbra to deal with. Sweep units can easily ruin your entire feeding strategy in the waves they are in. Luckily, there is no combat where every wave will be a sweep unit. Mostly they will be in every second wave, but that is still enough to mess you up quite a bit. And if you take spike trials, your magma and lifesteal morsels will suicide themselves. And that's another reason why Wing Technology is good, because it prevents that. Yeah, so Umbra has very high quality artifacts if you care about morsels, which most Umbra builds will do, but not all of them. So if you are a morsel heavy Umbra deck, don't be afraid to visit as many artifact shops and Hursel's Horde as you can, just because these artifacts will provide a lot of power or consistency to your build. So let's look at the Umbra as a whole clan. What is Umbra good at? What can it do well? What are its weaknesses? How can it be a support to other clan strategies? Umbra has multiple ways to grow every unit as long as it is in the front. So that helps a lot with having your tanks survive, dealing with bosses, things like that are definitely strong, strong suits for the Umbra clan. Um, they are great at having the front line, getting the front line buffed with morsels, having them survive with damage shield, lifesteal from other cards as well, like Grovel or Void Binding or Immortal Trade. Things like these make sure they can have their front line survive, they can buff up their front line, and finally be very, very powerful boss killing machines. especially if they stack up a bunch of lifesteal, a bunch of damage shield, or just a bunch of pure raw stats. So Umbra is good at killing bosses. Backlines, Umbra can deal with backlines. They have some ways, but they need to go out of their way to do it. Not like Awoken and Stygian Guard that just use Spike and Sweep to just automatically kill all the backlines every turn. Umbra actually needs to put in some effort to kill backlines. They do have a bunch of cards. They have Mind Collapse, they have Entumbra Assault, they have Shadow Eater, they have Excavation Eruption, they have Trample, they even have a multi-strike unit. All of these can help a lot with dealing with backlines, but you oftentimes have to purposely pick a card that deals with backlines. And this is important. So oftentimes it is important to get one of these cards or even multiple of these cards so you can deal with backlines. Sometimes the damage shields or lifesteal won't save you if there is a huge amount of damage from the backline incoming, especially something like Shade Wings, which are 15 5 units with multi-strike. These can deal 30 damage by themselves, and they sometimes come in waves of 2 behind a tanky front line. So if you don't have something to take them out, maybe your damage shield and lifesteal won't save your units. So it is important to pick up some of the cards Umbra has available to them to deal with backlines. They do have pretty good cards to do the job, but you need to pick them up purposely. Um, Next up is the frontline units. How good are Umbra in dealing with frontlines? Well, consider their scaling nature with the morsels and gorge buffs and things like that. The huge amount of scaling built in Umbra, that means they will become good at killing frontlines, but oftentimes they will start out a bit weak. There are a few ways to help with that. The most obvious one is Trample Penumbra, who comes in as a huge stat stick, strong enough to deal with frontline units almost by himself. The front lines on the final uh, in the final fights have 190 HP, so it's not quite enough. The front lines on the middle parts of the fight will have 95 to 100 HP, so again a little bit short. The early front lines will have 40 to 45 HP, so the first Penumbra can oftentimes kill these by themselves. So Trample Penumbra is a good way of dealing with frontline. Architect Penumbra is also pretty decent. He has a high attack stat, not that much health, so he needs some protection, but he can also increase the floor size, so he can be behind other units and help with killing front lines and bosses. So that's also a very nice way to deal with front lines, and obviously Gorge Penumbra can deal with front lines after a few turns, after he's eaten a bunch of morsels. Um, Other ways include things like Excavation Eruption and Blazing Bolts, which do enough damage to deal with front lines. Alloyed Construct can easily get to enough power as well to deal significant damage to frontline units. So they do have the capabilities, but very often Umbra requires some time to kill front lines. So oftentimes you are looking to buy some time by setting up on the top floor, start scaling as fast as possible, and then when the first units arrive at your floor, you might be able to take them out. Maybe for the first 1 or 2 waves you need some help from spells with things like Excavation Eruption or something like that. But after that you might be fine and your units will just grow strong enough to kill frontline units by themselves. Now, because Umbra is so good at boss killing and has so many scaling elements already, I think the Glutton is a bit worse than it appears, just because it hogs morsels that might be used on other units instead. It takes time to grow before it can actually be good, and Umbra just can grow another unit instead. Sure, most other units don't grow as fast as Penumbra or quite as powerful, but oftentimes they grow powerful enough and start out maybe even a bit stronger than Penumbra. So for that reason, I tend to avoid Glutton Penumbra unless I start with a plethora of capacity increasing or morsel generating cards. Then the Glutton Penumbra can actually work quite decently. Trample Penumbra is especially great in Ember Drain builds because he comes with Trample, so all the buffs you put on him are actually great because he can kill the entire floor if he has enough rage stacked on him from all those Ember Drain cards. So that's something that works very well with Trample Penumbra. It can also work with Architect Penumbra, is a bit weaker there. Um, Ember Drain builds are usually looking to uh, pick up the Ember Drain cards. Almost all of them are great in Ember Drain builds. Perils mostly to play other non-Ember Drain cards. Void Binding for its great damage scaling and protection. The Immortal trait for its amazing ability to keep the unit alive and having it be an amazing boss killer, and finally Furnace Tap for the multi-strike it provides. These are all very good in Ember Drain builds, obviously, but there are other good cards in Ember Drain builds, especially things like Packed Morsels can be nice if you have another unit besides Penumbra or have additional capacity to use Morsels. Any zero cost cards, honestly, can be used very well in Ember Drain. Usually you want Ember Drain to be relatively unit light because you're mostly about buffing up your Trample Penumbra with these Ember Drain cards, but other units can also carry them to good effect, especially something like an Alloy Construct if you can manage to feed it despite the Ember Drain. Ember Drain builds also want to go to every uh, Merchant of Magic to cost reduce a lot of their spells, so they can play them even if they are Ember Drained. The Architect Penumbra can work very well with as an additional damage source behind your other Gorge units and is very powerful that way because it is very unique in Umbra. Umbra really doesn't have a concept of a backline damage unit usually, but Penumbra, Architect Penumbra can fulfill this role, and it is actually quite good at it with 100 attack by base in the final stage. 50 attack still pretty decent. 25 attack good enough for the early game. All in all, it's not that great of a backline, not just because you can't enhance it on a Merchant of Steel with things like Multi-Strike or Quick. So it is limited in that regard, but it is still decently powerful, especially considering that it doesn't really take up capacity and is basically a free backline unit by the time it reaches tier 2 and even increases the capacity you can use for other stuff in tier 3. It also has some nice weird interactions with Transcend Imp, which can copy its summon effect, or reforming it, which can make its summon effect repeatable. But these are very niche interactions and usually not the main reason to pick Architect Penumbra. So all in all, I think Umbra is quite a powerful. One thing I want to talk about uh, is what that I forgot to talk about is as a support clan, Umbra has amazing cards to support the other strategies that are mainly based on other clans, with cards like Kindle, Embercash providing energy, cards like uh, like Space Prism, Crucible extension providing capacity, engine upgrade providing Ember. So Umbra can make many strategies that already work in other clans work a lot smoother and better thanks to their capacity increases and Ember production increases they can offer. So even if you don't really want to play with morsels at all, Umbra might still be a decent clan for you just to get these capacity and Ember upgrades that you usually have to pick certain specific boss artifacts to get. Umbra can give you these in other ways. Especially Space Prism and Engine upgrade are outstanding in that regard. So finally I want to talk about who Umbra works best with and who Umbra has a little bit of a problem working together. Some clan synergies between Umbra and other clans. So let's start with Hellhound. Both of them have ways to gain rage, but Umbra has rage limited on Ember Drain cards, which can be a bit of an issue, especially considering Hellhound has a lot of high cost cards. Um, some cards in Hellhound can work very well with morsels. Most importantly, the Hornbreaker Prince with multi-strike can benefit a lot from being fed morsels too. No other unit comes with multi-strike 4, so every offensive morsel you feed to this guy can pay off so much. That's a nice interaction between those two. Other than that, the high cost cards in Hellhound, things like One Horn's Tome, Branding Rite, Enflame, Ritual of Battle, Inferno, things like these might be a bit easier to cast with the Umbra Ember Manipulation. The Umbra Ember Manipulation also benefits from relics like the Unbroken Horn. So there is a decent amount of synergy there. Armor works very well with damage shield. You can stack damage shield and armor at the same time. They don't get in their way. Um, it works a lot less well with lifesteal because the enemies will be hitting your armor instead of your health, and the lifesteal will be wasted. So if you are planning on using armor, maybe you don't want to use lifesteal, but you might want to use damage shield if you need additional protection. So that's something that can work well between these clans. Other than that, I wouldn't say there are too many synergies between Umbra and Hellhound, but it's a solid clan combination that can fit, uh, that can do a lot of work. Also, Hellhound can help with Umbra's long wind-up times. They need to be able to deal with front lines because Hellhound often has front-loaded damage. So that can help. Next, Awoken. Awoken is, in my opinion, a bit harder to make work. Umbra has other defensive mechanics that don't interact with healing very well, but a few cards that heal can be valuable in Umbra, especially Unleash the Wildwood, because they get such high HP units by the end of a combat with all the morsel buffs and stuff. Um, then Umbra has great ways to deal with backline units, but these sweep units are very hard to use with Umbra. So mostly that leaves spikes as a good way of dealing with backline units passively. That is a nice niche that uh, that Awoken can fill a bit better than Umbra. Uh, Awoken has a similar problem in Umbra in that it's not very good at dealing with frontline units right away. So that might be a bit of an issue if you play Awoken and Umbra together. Definitely make sure you focus on taking cards that help you deal with frontline units early on. These One of the best synergetic cards between these clans is Awoken's Rail Spike, which can become completely insane with Umbra's energy generation and make most of your deck free and give you a bunch of cards to play in a single turn. So many of my successful Awoken Umbra combination runs have been with uh, Awoken Railspike. And finally, one less obvious synergy between these two is that Lifesteal can actually trigger Rejuvenate, which can be very powerful with these hollows, and especially with Rejuvenate Sentient, if you have Lifesteal from Umbra to trigger these abilities multiple times. Stygian Guard doesn't have immediate synergies with Umbra that are obvious, but Stygian Guard does have one thing going for them, and that is they are the master of dealing with frontline units. They have so many spells that hit frontline units for a huge amount, from Crypt Builder and Ancient Synergy over Helical Crystallis, uh, Titan's Gratitude, even the base spell Ice Frozen Lands is made to hit front lines. Not that that one deals a lot of damage, but it's definitely clear that Stygian has good tools of dealing with waves of, with front lines in a few waves, and after maybe you take out the first few frontline units with Stygian spells, and the later with these buffed up Umbra units that have grown big. Another benefit between those clans that is a bit less apparent at first is that many of the spells Umbra plays can be played on any floor. Things like Making of a Morsel, Shade Splitter. Many of these cards that generate morsels can easily be played on any floor, so you can use these to trigger an income floor even if you plan on playing their morsels on a different floor. So that can work out as well. Other than that, I think there's not much to say. I think these two just work well together because they cover each other's weaknesses. So, yeah. And Melting Remnant Umbra has huge synergies in both directions. Umbra provides a lot of friendly unit deaths, which can matter a lot for some of the Melting Remnant cards, like a Fatal Melting or Harvest triggers. Feeding morsels to a Wickless Baron or a Wickless Tycoon can produce a bunch of Harvest triggers on them. Uh, Maybe if you have something like an Architect Penumbra, a Wickless Baron, and a Gorge unit on the same floor, and with thanks to the Architect Penumbra, that will even leave you some capacity for morsels, and then you can feed the morsels to the Gorge unit and benefit from the harvest as well. Things like that can work out really well. But in the other direction, it works as well. Uh, Reform from the melting remnant can bring back morsels. That doesn't sound too exciting at first, but you can target these morsels. You can bring back specifically lifesteal, damage shield, and morsel miners just to get the right morsel at any given turn with things like a cost reduced holdover molded. That's very nice. Or just the champion upgrade for Rector Flicker that reforms randomly every turn, the Dark Calling Path. Things like these can generate a lot of good morsels for you, and these morsels will have increased stats, so they won't die as easily to things like sweep or spikes, and can even do some damage or block some damage for you. So there is a lot of synergy between Umbra and Melting Remnant. Um, So probably the worst clan to synergize with Umbra is Awoken. Next up, Hellhound, Stygian Guard is one of the better ones, and finally the best one would be Melting Remnant, most of the time. But to be honest, Umbra synergizes quite well with anyone, in my opinion. And that brings me to the end of this guide. I hope my insights have helped you understand Umbra a bit better, the mechanics behind Umbra, how to rate some of their cards and artifacts, and even maybe what their weaknesses and strengths and synergies with other cards are. So if my guide helped you play Umbra a little better, have a bit more success, maybe discover some new strategies, maybe you weren't aware that Ember Drain is actually a functioning build, things like that, I am very glad. Um, and stay tuned for future guides. My next one is most likely gonna be about Hellhound, and I hope I can bring it to you in about a week at most, maybe even earlier.